Before we begin, find a comfortable position. Let your breathing settle. What we're about to explore together is a story that unfolds slowly, across months of darkness, in one of the quietest places on Earth. For thousands of years, the Inuit people lived in the Arctic, where winter brings something most of us have never experienced. The sun disappears completely, not for a day or two, but for months at a time. The world enters a long twilight, and life continues in the cold and the dark. This is not a story of desperate survival or dramatic struggle. It's something quieter than that. It's about patience, about ingenuity, about the careful ways people learned to create warmth and light when the natural world offered almost none. It's about families gathered in small snow-domed shelters, lit by a single flame. About hunters standing perfectly still on the frozen sea. About clothing that worked like a second skin, trapping warmth in layers of air. About time itself dissolving into a different rhythm when there are no sunrises to mark the days. Tonight, we'll move through that world together, step by step. We'll see how the Inuit turned snow into shelter, seal oil into light, and caribou fur into protection against cold that could kill in minutes. We'll listen to the silence of the polar night, watch the moon cross the sky, and sit beside the lamp that was the heart of every home. There's no urgency here, no need to rush, just a long, steady journey into a season that was dark, cold, and somehow, against all expectation, peaceful. Let the story carry you. Let your mind wander through the ice and the stillness. We'll be here in the Arctic winter for as long as you need. The polar night did not arrive suddenly. It announced itself slowly over weeks as the sun's daily arc across the sky grew shorter and shallower. Each day, the light lasted a little less. Each day the sun sat lower on the horizon, its warmth fading long before its visibility. This was the preparation season, and the Inuit understood its importance. They had lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, and the rhythm of the sun's departure was as familiar to them as the tides or the migrations of caribou. The light was leaving. The cold was coming. There was work to be done. During these weeks, the air itself began to change. The first hints of the true, deep cold settled over the land and the sea. The wind carried a new sharpness. The ice along the shore thickened. The world was transitioning, and so were the people who lived in it. Hunters went out while the light still allowed it. They searched for caribou moving across the tundra in the amber glow of the low-hanging sun. Caribou fur, thick and dense with the approach of winter, was essential. The hollow hairs of their winter coats trapped air with an efficiency unmatched by almost any other material. This fur would become the primary insulation for clothing, the difference between warmth and death in the months ahead. Seals were hunted on the forming sea ice. Their meat would be cached, stored in the frozen ground where it would keep for months without spoiling. Their blubber would be rendered into oil, the fuel that would feed the lamps through the long darkness. Their skins, tough and waterproof, would be used for boots and outer garments. Women worked steadily, preparing hides. Caribou skins had to be scraped, softened and cut. Sealskins had to be cleaned and made supple. Sinew, the strong tendon tissue from caribou legs, was dried and split into fine threads for sewing. Needles carved from bone or ivory were sharpened and kept ready. Nothing was wasted. Every part of every animal had a purpose. Bones became tools, toggles and needles. Antlers became handles and scrapers. Intestines, cleaned and dried, became translucent waterproof material for windows or parkas. The Inuit relationship with the animals they hunted was one of profound respect and total utility. Children helped where they could, learning by watching. A young girl would sit beside her mother, observing the precise angle of the scraping blade, the tension required to soften a hide without tearing it, the way sinew was split and rolled into thread. A young boy would follow his father or uncle, learning to read the ice, to recognize the signs of a seal's breathing hole, to move quietly and with patience. The sun continued its descent. Its light turned from amber to deep cold gold. The shadows it cast grew longer, stretching across the snow and ice like dark fingers reaching toward the horizon. The world was beautiful in this transitional light, but there was an edge to it, a reminder that beauty alone would not sustain life in the months ahead. Families moved to their winter locations. Some would spend the season in permanent or semi-permanent settlements, living in sod houses dug into the earth. Others would move out onto the sea ice itself, following the seals and building temporary snow houses as needed. The choice depended on many things: the availability of game, the preferences of the family, the location of other families in their group. The work was constant, but it was not frantic. The Inuit had done this before, every year, for generations beyond counting. There was a rhythm to the preparation, a steady accumulation of readiness. Food was gathered, fuel was stored, clothing was sewn, tools were sharpened, and all the while the sun sank lower. The quality of the light changed. It became softer, more diffuse, as if the air itself was thickening. The cold deepened. Breath began to hang visible in the air for longer and longer. The first true snowfalls arrived, covering the tundra in a blanket of white that would not melt until spring. And then, after weeks of this slow transition, the day arrived when the sun's upper edge touched the southern horizon one last time. It paused there, a brief half-circle of orange and red against the ice, and then it slipped below. The sky held the colour for a while, a deep glow that faded slowly to violet, then to indigo, then to the first stars. The polar night had begun. The day the sun disappeared was not marked by ceremony or ritual in the way a modern person might expect. There was no collective gathering, no countdown, no moment of shared acknowledgement. The Inuit relationship with the sun's departure was practical and observational. They knew it was leaving. They knew it would return. The moment of its vanishing was simply a point of transition, noted and accepted. But that does not mean the moment passed without notice. When the last sliver of the sun slipped below the horizon and did not return, the world that remained was transformed. What descended was not absolute blackness. That is the common misunderstanding. The polar night is not a light switch flipped to off. It is something more subtle, more complex. For several hours each day, around what would be called midday if the clock still mattered, a faint glow remained on the southern horizon. This was civil twilight, the sun far below the curve of the earth, but still close enough that its light grazed the upper atmosphere. During this period, the world was bathed in soft, indirect illumination. The sky was a deep indigo blending into violet near the horizon. The snow and ice reflected this light, amplifying it, giving the landscape a pearlescent quality. It was dim, yes, but it was not dark. Shadows were faint but still visible. A person could see the shape of the land, the outline of ice formations, the silhouette of another person moving in the distance. This twilight lasted for a few hours at most, and then it faded. The indigo deepened to black, and the stars emerged. In the Arctic, far from any artificial light, the stars are not the faint distant points visible from a city. They are brilliant, hard, and close. They fill the sky completely, thousands upon thousands of them, their light sharp and cold. The Milky Way is not a faint smudge, but a river of light cutting across the dome of the heavens. Constellations that are barely visible elsewhere shine with clarity. The Inuit knew these stars. They had names for them, stories about them, practical uses for them. Certain stars marked directions, others indicated the time of year or the turning of the tides. The sky was not decoration. It was a map, a calendar, and a source of knowledge. And then there was the moon. With the sun absent, the moon became the primary source of natural light. Its cycle, roughly 2 weeks of waxing and 2 weeks of waning, dictated much of the rhythm of life during the polar night. When the moon was new, the darkness was nearly complete, save for the stars. When the moon was full, the transformation was remarkable. A full moon in the Arctic, reflecting off the snow and ice, creates a landscape of startling brightness. The world becomes silver and black, shadows sharp and defined, the texture of the snow visible in every ripple and drift. Visibility can extend for miles. The ice fields glitter, each tiny crystal catching and reflecting the moon's cold light. This was the time for travel. Hunters would move across the sea ice under the full moon, searching for the breathing holes of seals. Families would visit neighbouring camps, walking for hours under the lunar glow. The brightness made it possible to see the dangers of the ice, cracks, pressure ridges, thin spots, and to navigate safely. The moon's light was steady, reliable, and predictable. It rose and set in its own arc, independent of the sun, tracing a path across the sky that the Inuit tracked and understood. For 2 weeks, it would grow brighter each night, reaching its peak, and then for 2 weeks it would fade. The cycle was constant, a rhythm that replaced the rising and setting of the sun. But the moon did more than provide light. It also marked time. Without the sun's daily passage to divide the hours, the lunar cycle became a primary temporal marker. A successful hunt might be remembered as happening 2 full moons ago. A journey might be planned for when the moon is bright again. Time became lunar, cyclical, and fluid. The transformation of the world was not limited to light. Temperature dropped sharply once the sun was gone. The cold that had been hinted at during the preparation season now arrived in full force. Air temperatures fell to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero on the Celsius scale, a range where Celsius and Fahrenheit nearly converge, where the numbers almost cease to matter, because the cold itself becomes the dominant reality. This was not the cold of a winter day further south, where a person might feel a chill and pull their coat tighter. This was a cold that penetrated, that seeped through layers, that found every gap and opening. It was a cold that made breath freeze instantly into clouds of ice crystals. It was a cold that made exposed skin burn and then go numb in minutes. It was a cold that turned moisture into ice on contact. And yet the Inuit did not speak of it as an enemy. It was simply the condition of their world. They had no word for cold as a complaint. They had many words for different types of snow, different qualities of ice, different conditions of weather, but the cold itself was not something to be fought. It was something to be understood, adapted to, and lived within. The sea ice, which had been forming and thickening throughout the preparation season, was now solid. The ocean beneath it was still there, dark and alive with seals and fish, but its surface was locked. The ice formed pressure ridges where moving plates collided, creating jagged, chaotic landscapes of upended blocks. It formed smooth plains where the freezing had been calm and still. It cracked and shifted with the tides and the currents below, sending sharp, booming reports echoing across the frozen expanse. The land itself was covered in snow, deep and unbroken. The tundra, which in summer was a carpet of low vegetation, mosses and lichens, was now a featureless white plain. Rock outcroppings became navigation markers, rare, features in an otherwise uniform world. The landscape was simple, stark, and immense. And over all of this, the ice, the snow, the stars, the moon, there was a silence. The silence of the polar night is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. It is not merely the absence of noise, it is a presence in itself, a weight, a texture. Sound itself seems to change in the extreme cold. The air is dense. The snow muffles everything. There are no trees to rustle in the wind, no flowing water to murmur, no birds to call. The world is frozen, and the freezing absorbs sound. What remains are only the smallest, sharpest noises. The crack of ice shifting in the distance, the squeak of footsteps on dry, cold snow, the faint whisper of wind moving powder across the surface, and the sound of one's own breath, which in the profound cold becomes almost startlingly loud, a rhythmic cloud of freezing vapour that marks the only other presence in the stillness. This was the world the Inuit entered when the sun disappeared, a world of silver and black, of stars and moonlight, of cold and silence. It was not a world that invited casual existence. It demanded preparation, knowledge, and constant, careful attention. But it was also a world of profound beauty, of clarity, of a kind of peace that could not exist in a place of warmth and light. The sun was gone. The dark season had arrived, and life, as it had for thousands of years, continued. The moon, in the absence of the sun, became more than a celestial body. It became the measure of time, the marker of safety and the enabler of movement. Its cycle governed the rhythm of activity during the polar night in ways that are difficult for those living under the sun's daily passage to fully grasp. When the moon was new, dark and invisible, the nights were at their most profound. The stars provided some light, and the faint twilight glow at midday offered a few hours of dim visibility, but the true darkness settled heavily during this phase. Travel was limited, hunting was difficult. Families stayed close to their shelters, tending to indoor tasks, conserving energy, waiting for the moon's return. But as the moon began to wax, growing night by night into a thin crescent and then a thicker arc, the world opened up again. Light increased incrementally. Shadows reappeared. The landscape, which had been a vague suggestion of shapes in the darkness, became defined once more. By the time the moon reached its full phase, the Arctic was transformed. The brightness was extraordinary. A person standing on the sea ice under a full moon could see for miles in every direction. The snow reflected the lunar light with such intensity that the world seemed almost to glow from within. Ice crystals on the surface sparkled like scattered diamonds. Pressure ridges cast long, dramatic shadows. The horizon was clear and sharp. This was the hunting moon. Hunters would venture out, alone or in small groups, moving across the frozen sea with confidence. The light was sufficient to see the subtle signs they relied on: the faint dome of frost over a seal's breathing hole, the texture of ice that indicated thickness or weakness, the tracks of Arctic foxes or polar bears that might lead to a kill site or a den. The breathing holes, called igloo, were the focus of much of the winter hunting. Ringed seals, the most common prey, lived under the ice, but they were air-breathing mammals. They needed to surface regularly to breathe, and they maintained small openings in the ice for this purpose. The seals kept these holes clear using their claws and the warmth of their breath, but the holes were often covered by a thin dome of frost or a layer of soft snow, making them nearly invisible to the untrained eye. Finding a breathing hole required patience and keen observation. Hunters would walk slowly across the ice, scanning the surface. A trained dog might help, sniffing the air for the scent of seal breath. Once a hole was located, the hunter faced a different kind of challenge: the weight. Seals did not surface on a predictable schedule. A seal might use a breathing hole once an hour, or once every few hours, or it might not return to that particular hole for an entire day. The hunter had no way of knowing. He simply had to wait. He would position himself near the hole, standing, or sometimes sitting, on a small block of ice, or a folded skin. He held his harpoon ready, the line carefully coiled, the point sharp. And then he became still. This stillness was not passive. It was an active, disciplined practice. The hunter could not shift his weight frequently or fidget. Any vibration transmitted through the ice might alert the seal below. He could not cough or clear his throat loudly. He could not stamp his feet to stay warm, though the cold was severe and constant. He stood or sat, and he waited. The cold during these waits was punishing. 40 degrees below zero, with no movement to generate body heat, the risk of frostbite was real. But the hunter's clothing, if properly made and maintained, provided remarkable protection. The double layer of caribou fur, the sealskin boots with their thick inner liners, the mittens designed to keep the fingers together. These were not just garments. They were the technology that made the weight survivable. The hunter's breath would freeze in the air, forming tiny ice crystals that drifted slowly downward. His eyelashes might collect frost. His beard, if he had one, would become a mass of ice. But inside his layered furs, his core remained warm. The hollow hairs of the caribou trapped air, and that air, warmed by his body, created an insulating envelope. And he waited. Minutes stretched into an hour into 2. The moon moved slowly across the sky. The stars wheeled overhead. The ice creaked and groaned in the distance, the sound carrying clearly in the cold, still air. And the hunter remained motionless, listening. The sound of a seal surfacing was faint, a soft exhalation, a gentle splash as the animal pushed up through the narrow opening. The hunter had only seconds. He would strike with the harpoon, driving it down through the hole, aiming for the body of the seal beneath. If the strike was true, the harpoon's toggling head would turn sideways inside the seal and the line would hold. The hunter would then widen the hole with an ice pick and pull the seal up onto the surface. If the strike missed, the seal was gone, and the wait began again. When a seal was successfully taken, it was a moment of quiet satisfaction, not celebration. The hunter would acknowledge the animal, sometimes speaking a few words of thanks or respect. The seal's body would be butchered on the ice. The blubber would be cut away in thick strips, the meat sectioned, the skin carefully preserved. Everything would be loaded onto a sled or carried back to the camp. The seal's blubber was the prize. Rendered into oil, it would feed the qulliq lamps, providing light and heat for days or weeks depending on the size of the animal. The meat would feed the family and the dogs. The skin would be used for clothing or for covering kayaks when spring returned. Nothing was wasted. But not every hunt was successful. Some nights, the hunter would return empty-handed after hours on the ice. This was accepted. The animals gave themselves when they chose to. Luck, skill, and the favour of the spirits all played a role. A hunter did not control the outcome. He could only prepare, wait, and act when the moment came. The full moon phase lasted roughly a week, and during this time activity increased across the winter camps. It was a time for visiting, for checking on neighbours, for moving supplies between families. The brightness made travel safe and social interaction possible. People would walk for hours under the moon, following familiar routes across the ice, arriving at neighbouring igloos to share food, stories and warmth. These visits were important. The polar night, for all its stillness and peace, was also a time of isolation. Families lived in small enclosed spaces. The darkness and cold limited movement. The opportunity to see other faces, to hear other voices, to break the routine of one's own household was more than a social pleasure. It was a psychological necessity. And then, inevitably, the moon began to wane. The brightness faded, night by night, as the illuminated portion of the moon's face shrank. The shadows softened and then disappeared. The landscape became dim again, and then dark. The period of easy travel and hunting ended, and the world turned inward once more. The cycle would repeat. New moon to crescent to full to crescent to new again, roughly every 29 days. Each full moon brought another window of light and activity. Each new moon brought a return to the deeper darkness and the quieter, more contained life of the igloo. The moon's rhythm was steady, predictable, and reliable. It structured time in a way that was different from the sun's daily rising and setting, but no less real. The Inuit did not fight this rhythm. They worked within it, planning their activities around the moon's phases, resting during the dark periods, moving during the bright ones. This was not a hardship. It was simply the way life was lived in the polar night. The moon was a companion, a light in the darkness, a marker of time's passage. It waxed and waned, and the people below moved with it, adapting their lives to its ancient, unchanging cycle. On some nights, when the sky was clear and the moon had set or had not yet risen, another light appeared in the Arctic darkness. It was not a light from the ground or from any human source. It came from above, from the sky itself, and it moved. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, appeared as soft curtains of colour rippling across the zenith. The Inuit called them arsanit. They were pale green most often, sometimes tinged with pink or violet, and they moved with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, folding and unfolding like fabric stirred by an invisible wind. The lights were silent. They made no sound, though there are occasional reports from observers claiming to hear faint crackling or hissing noises during particularly intense displays. Whether these sounds are real or imagined, or the result of some atmospheric condition not yet fully understood, remains unclear. But in the Inuit experience, as passed down through stories, the aurora was a quiet presence, a visual phenomenon without auditory accompaniment. The colours were subtle. This was not the vivid, almost neon brightness sometimes seen in photographs, taken with long exposures and enhanced sensors. To the human eye, under normal conditions, the aurora was gentle, almost pastel. The green was a soft, luminous shade, like light filtering through water. The pink, when it appeared, was delicate, barely there, a suggestion of a warmth in the cold sky. The violet was deeper but still muted, a twilight hue that blended into the blackness at the edges. The lights appeared most often during the deepest part of winter, when the nights were longest and the sky was darkest. They favoured certain conditions: clear skies, low humidity, and magnetic activity in the upper atmosphere that corresponded to solar storms far away on the sun's surface. But these were details the Inuit did not know in scientific terms. They knew the lights came when they came, more common in some winters than others, more intense on some nights than others. The aurora's appearance was tied to the spiritual worldview of the Inuit. They did not see the lights as a purely physical phenomenon, though they certainly observed and understood their patterns. They saw them as something more, as the presence of the spirits. One common belief was that the aurora represented the souls of the dead, particularly the souls of ancestors who had passed on. These spirits were playing, dancing, celebrating in the sky. The lights were their movement, their joy, their continued existence in a realm beyond the physical world. Watching the aurora was, in this interpretation, a way of feeling connected to those who had come before, a reminder that death was not an ending but a transition. Another interpretation held that the aurora was connected to animals, particularly to the spirits of the animals that had been hunted. The lights were the souls of seals, caribou, whales, and other creatures moving through the sky, free and at peace. This belief reinforced the respect and gratitude the Inuit felt toward the animals that gave their lives to sustain human life. There were also practical stories. Some said that the aurora was a path, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of spirits. Shamans, it was said, could travel along this path, moving into the spirit realm to seek guidance, to heal the sick, or to influence the weather and the hunt. The aurora was, in this sense, a doorway, a point of contact between the physical and the metaphysical. Children were sometimes warned not to whistle or make loud noises when the aurora was visible. The lights, it was said, might be attracted by such sounds and come closer. Whether this was seen as dangerous or simply inappropriate varied by region and family, but the underlying message was one of respect. The aurora was not a spectacle to be treated lightly. It was a presence that deserved acknowledgement and appropriate behaviour. The aurora's movement was slow most of the time. The curtains would ripple gently, drifting from one part of the sky to another, brightening and fading in waves. Sometimes the lights would gather at the zenith, directly overhead, forming a corona, a circular or spiral pattern that seemed to emanate from a single point. This was considered a particularly powerful and beautiful display. On rare occasions, the aurora would become more active. The curtains would pulse rapidly, colours shifting and intensifying, the movement faster and more chaotic. These displays were dramatic, but even then, there was a quality of grace to the aurora, a sense that the lights were moving according to their own rhythm, their own logic. For the Inuit living in the long darkness, the aurora was a companion. It was a reminder that the sky, though dark, was not empty. It was a source of beauty in a landscape that could be, to an outsider, monotonous and severe. It was a connection to the spiritual world, a sign that the forces beyond human understanding were present and active. The lights did not provide warmth. They did not provide practical illumination for work or travel. But they provided something else, a sense of wonder, a feeling of being part of something larger, a momentary escape from the cold and the stillness of the frozen world. A family sitting inside an igloo, the qulliq lamp burning steadily, might step outside for a few moments to watch the aurora. The cold would be immediate and sharp, but the sight above would be worth the discomfort. The sky rippling with soft green and pink, the stars visible between the moving curtains, the silence absolute except for the faint creak of the ice underfoot. They would watch for a while, and then they would return inside to the warmth and the light of the lamp carrying the memory of the aurora with them. It was a gift of the polar night, one of the few things that could not exist in the same way under the sun's glare. The darkness, in this sense, was not only a challenge, it was also an opportunity to see something rare and beautiful, something that belonged uniquely to the long winter. The aurora would fade eventually, the colours dimming, the curtains dissolving into the general blackness of the sky. The stars would remain, sharp and cold. The moon, if it was up, would continue its slow arc, and the Inuit would continue their lives, carrying the image of the lights with them, a quiet presence in the back of their minds, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness there was still light. The polar night was defined as much by what could be heard as by what could be seen. In the absence of the sun, with temperatures far below freezing, the acoustic landscape of the Arctic became something entirely distinct from any environment further south. Sound behaves differently in extreme cold. Air at 40 degrees below zero is denser than warmer air, and this density affects how sound waves travel. Some sounds carry farther, with greater clarity. Others are absorbed, muffled, or simply do not occur at all. The most pervasive quality of the polar night's soundscape was silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, which is really just a reduction of noise, but a deeper, more absolute silence, a stillness so complete that it became a tangible presence. There were reasons for this. The frozen landscape absorbed sound. Snow, especially the deep soft snow that covered the tundra and accumulated on the sea ice, acted as a natural sound insulator. When footsteps fell on this snow, they made a faint squeaking sound, but the sound did not echo or carry. It was swallowed almost immediately by the surrounding whiteness. There was no running water. Every stream, every pond, every trickle of moisture was frozen solid. The sound of water, which is so constant in temperate climates that it often goes unnoticed, was entirely absent. There were no trees. The Arctic is treeless, or nearly so. In some southern regions of the Inuit range there might be scattered, stunted willows, but in the true polar regions there was nothing taller than low shrubs, and these were buried under snow in winter. There was no rustling of leaves, no creaking of branches, no wind moving through a canopy. The wind, when it blew, moved across open snow and ice, producing a faint hissing or a low, hollow moan, but nothing like the complex layered sounds of wind in a forest. There were no birds. The Arctic summer is rich with bird life, gulls, terns, geese, ducks, and many others, but in winter nearly all of them migrate south. The few species that remain, like the ptarmigan or the raven, are silent much of the time, and their calls, when they do occur, are rare and startling events in the overall quiet. There were no insects, no buzzing, no chirping, no hum of life. The cold eliminated all of that completely. What remained were only the sounds of the ice, the wind, and the occasional presence of animals or humans. The ice was the most vocal element of the landscape. Sea ice, in particular, was a living, shifting thing. It floated on the ocean, and though it was frozen solid on the surface, it was subject to tides, currents, and the immense pressures of its own weight and movement. As the ice shifted, it produced sounds. Sometimes these were sharp, sudden cracks, loud reports that echoed across the frozen expanse like gunshots. These were the sounds of the ice breaking, of pressure ridges forming, of the frozen surface adjusting to the forces beneath it. They could occur at any time, day or night, and they were startling in the otherwise profound quiet. Other times, the ice produced longer, more sustained sounds, groans, creaks, deep rumbles that seemed to come from far below. These were the sounds of the ice plates grinding against each other, of the ocean's pressure moving masses of frozen water. They were deep, resonant, almost musical in their complexity, and they carried for miles. For the Inuit, these sounds were not just noise, they were information. The cracking and groaning of the ice indicated its condition, its stability, its safety. A hunter on the sea ice learned to distinguish between the sound of normal movement and the sound of dangerous fracturing. An experienced person could hear the ice and know whether it was safe to cross, whether a pressure ridge was forming nearby, whether the tide was shifting and the ice was beginning to move. The wind, when it blew, added its own layer to the soundscape. Arctic winds could be fierce, sustained, unbroken flows of air moving across hundreds of miles of open ice with nothing to slow them. These winds produced a steady, low roar, a constant presence that filled the ears and made conversation difficult. But the polar night was not defined by constant wind. There were periods, sometimes lasting days, when the air was perfectly still. During these calm times, the silence deepened even further. There was no wind, no movement, no sound at all except the occasional crack of the ice in the distance and the sound of one's own breath. Breath itself became a noticeable sound in the cold. Each exhalation produced a cloud of vapour that froze instantly into tiny ice crystals. This freezing made a faint crackling sound, barely audible, but present. Breathing was not just a biological process, it was an acoustic event, a reminder of the cold's intensity. Footsteps on snow also had a distinct sound, and this sound changed depending on the snow's temperature and texture. Soft, fresh snow produced a muffled crunch. Hard-packed, wind-compressed snow produced a squeak, a high-pitched, almost musical sound caused by the ice crystals compressing and fracturing under pressure. The colder the temperature, the more pronounced this squeak became. At the coldest temperatures, walking on snow sounded almost like walking on styrofoam, each step producing a sharp, dry squeak that carried in the still air. Animal sounds were rare but notable when they occurred. The seals, living under the ice, were mostly silent. though occasionally a hunter might hear the faint exhalation of a seal breathing at a hole. Arctic foxes, small and white-furred, sometimes barked or made yipping sounds, especially during the mating season. Polar bears, the largest predators, were generally silent, but they could be heard sniffing or breathing if they came close to a camp. Dogs, which many Inuit families kept for transportation and companionship, added their voices to the winter soundscape. They barked, howled, and communicated with each other in ways that were socially complex. A dog team, settling down for the night or reacting to the scent of a distant animal, could create a chorus of howls that echoed across the ice, a sound that was both eerie and comforting, a sign of life and companionship in the vast frozen emptiness. Human sounds were the most varied. Inside the igloo there were the quiet domestic sounds of daily life, the scrape of a knife on stone, the rustle of caribou hides, the soft murmur of conversation, the crackle of the qulliq lamp, the faint hiss of snow melting into water. Children played, sometimes quietly, sometimes with laughter or shouting that filled the small enclosed space. Outside, voices carried with remarkable clarity in the cold, still air. A person speaking in a normal tone could be heard from a surprising distance. This was both a convenience and a matter of safety. Families living in separate igloos could call to each other, check on neighbours, or signal for help if needed. Singing was also a part of the soundscape. The Inuit had a rich tradition of songs, work songs, story songs, drum songs. During the long nights, families and groups would sometimes gather to sing together, the voices blending in the small warm space of the igloo, the sound muffled by the snow walls but clear and resonant within. The drum, used in drum dancing, produced a deep rhythmic thud, a sound made by striking a large flat-frame drum covered with animal skin. The rhythm was steady, hypnotic, a pulse that filled the igloo and seemed to resonate in the chest. Drum dancing was a spiritual and social practice, a way of connecting with the spirit world and with each other, and the sound of the drum was central to this experience. But even with all these sounds, the ice, the wind, the animals, the dogs, the voices, the drum, the overarching quality of the polar night soundscape was stillness. The sounds were punctuation marks in a vast silence, moments of acoustic activity in a world that was otherwise profoundly, almost overwhelmingly quiet. This silence was not oppressive. For the Inuit, it was simply the nature of their environment. They did not fear it or find it uncomfortable. They lived within it, moved through it, and became part of it. The silence was a backdrop, a constant presence that shaped their perception of sound, their communication, and their experience of the world. In the deep cold and the long darkness, sound became precious. A voice in the quiet, the crackle of a fire, the howl of a dog. These were reminders of life, of presence, of connection. And the silence, vast and encompassing, was the canvas on which all of these sounds were painted. The igloo, or more precisely the igloo, is perhaps the most iconic image of Inuit life. The domed snow house, glowing from within in the darkness, has become a symbol of Arctic survival. But the reality of the igloo, both in its construction and its function, is more complex and more impressive than the simplified image suggests. The first thing to understand is that not all Inuit lived in snow houses year-round, or even during the entire winter. The word igloo in Inuktitut simply means house. It referred to any dwelling. A snow house was one type of igloo, but there were others. Many families, particularly those in regions where stone and driftwood were available, built semi-permanent winter homes called qulliq. These were substantial structures, partially dug into the ground to take advantage of the earth's insulation. The walls were made of stone, stacked without mortar, or of driftwood and whalebone in coastal areas where these materials could be gathered. The roof was typically a framework of wood or bone covered with layers of turf, thick slabs of earth held together by plant roots, and then insulated further with snow. The qulliq was substantial in ways the snow house was not. Families living in these sod houses would often occupy them for the entire winter, sometimes for multiple years if the location remained favourable for hunting. The process of building one required significant labour and planning. Men would dig into the earth, sometimes 3 or 4 feet down, creating a pit that would become the floor. The excavated soil would be set aside, and then the walls would rise. In coastal areas where driftwood was available, carried by ocean currents from forests far to the south, the framework might be constructed from these precious wooden beams. Inland, where no wood could be found, whale ribs and jawbones, massive and curved, served as structural supports. The weight of these bones required multiple people to move and position them. Stone gathered from rocky outcroppings would be stacked to fill in the walls between the bone or wood framework. The roof was the most complex element. A framework of smaller bones or driftwood pieces would be laid across the top, and then thick slabs of turf would be placed over this framework. The turf, cut carefully to preserve the root systems that held it together, was remarkably effective insulation. The living plant roots created a mat that resisted wind and held moisture. Over the turf, snow would be piled, adding another layer of protection. The result was a structure that was dark inside, even during the brief periods of twilight, but remarkably warm and stable. Living in a karmak was different from living in a snow house. The space was larger, often housing extended families, perhaps 10 or 15 people. The darkness was more complete, as stone and earth did not transmit light the way snow and ice could. But the structure was permanent, accumulating the warmth of many bodies and many lamps over weeks and months, creating an interior environment that was consistently comfortable. These sod houses were sturdy, dark and permanent structures. The entrance was low and tunnel-like, designed to trap cold air and prevent heat loss. Inside, raised sleeping platforms lined the walls, and a central area served as the communal space for cooking, eating and socializing. The qulliq lamp provided light and heat, just as it did in a snow house. But for families who followed the seals out onto the sea ice, or who needed temporary shelter during hunting trips, the snow house was essential. It could be built quickly, using only the materials at hand, and it provided remarkable insulation and protection from the wind and cold. Not just any snow would work. The Inuit required specific conditions. The snow had to be wind-packed, compressed by days or weeks of steady wind, until the individual snow crystals were pressed tightly together, interlocked and dense. This type of snow had a texture similar to dense foam. It could be cut cleanly with a knife and would hold its shape when lifted. Soft, fresh snow was useless for building. It would crumble and collapse. Icy, hard, frozen snow was also unsuitable. It was too brittle and would shatter when cut. The ideal snow had a density and consistency that came from specific weather conditions, and an experienced builder could assess the snow by touch and sight, testing it with a blade before committing to a construction. The construction process itself was a demonstration of engineering intuition developed over countless generations. The builder, almost always a man though there were exceptions, would select a site on flat, firm snow, ideally with a slight windbreak or natural protection nearby. He would mark out a circle, roughly 10 to 15 feet in diameter for a family-sized dwelling, and then begin cutting blocks. The choice of building site mattered more than might be obvious. The builder looked for specific conditions, flat ground if possible, to make the construction easier. Protection from prevailing winds, which often came from the north, meant seeking out the lee side of a pressure ridge or a slight rise in the landscape. Proximity to seal breathing holes was critical. A hunter did not want to walk for hours each time he went out, but not too close to active ice, where movement and cracking could be dangerous or disturbing. The snow depth at the site had to be sufficient. The builder needed enough material to cut blocks without running out, and he needed the floor of the igloo to be at a certain depth below the surrounding surface to create the cold trap effect. If the snow was too shallow, the structure would be compromised. If it was too deep, with soft layers underneath the packed surface, the floor might not be stable. Before cutting the first block, an experienced builder would test the snow in multiple spots, probing with a knife or a long bone tool, feeling for the density and consistency. He might cut a test block and examine its texture, looking at how cleanly it cut, how well it held its shape, whether it had the right combination of strength and workability. The blocks were cut from the snow inside the marked circle, creating a depression that would become the floor of the igloo. This served two purposes. It provided building material, and it lowered the living space below the level of the entrance, creating a natural cold trap. Each block was roughly 2 feet long, 1 foot high, and 6 inches thick. though sizes varied depending on the builder's preference and the snow's condition. The knife used for cutting was long and sharp, often made from bone or ivory in traditional times, later from metal when trade made that available. The blocks were not stacked in horizontal rows. Instead, they were placed in a continuous rising spiral. The first row of blocks was arranged in a circle, and then one end of this circle was cut at an angle, creating a ramp. The next blocks were placed on this ramp, each one angled slightly inward, each one resting on the block before it. This spiral construction was critical. It meant that the structure was self-supporting from the very beginning. There was no need for internal scaffolding or temporary supports. Each block locked into place, held by its angle and by the blocks around it. As the walls rose, the inward angle increased. The spiral tightened. The builder, working from inside the structure, would shape each block to fit precisely, trimming edges with the knife, packing loose snow into any small gaps. The final blocks at the top of the dome were carefully shaped to close the opening, and the last block, the keystone, was placed from inside, locking the entire structure into place. The result was a dome of remarkable strength. The shape itself, a catenary curve, distributed weight evenly across the entire structure. A person could stand on top of a properly built igloo without it collapsing. The snow blocks, interlocked and compressed, became a single, cohesive shell. But strength was only part of the igloo's genius. Its true value lay in its insulating properties. Snow, as mentioned before, is mostly trapped air, 90 to 95% depending on its density. Air is one of the best insulators available in nature, and the snow's structure kept this air immobile, preventing convection. The blocks of the igloo created a thick barrier between the interior and the exterior, a barrier that was remarkably effective at preventing heat loss. The entrance to the igloo was not a simple doorway. It was a tunnel, often curved or angled, and it frequently included a cold trap, a U-shaped bend where the tunnel dipped below the level of the interior floor and then rose again. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, would sink into this low point and stay there, unable to flow into the main living space. Warm air, generated by the qulliq and by body heat, would rise and remain in the upper part of the dome where the sleeping platform was located. This sleeping platform was built from snow blocks, creating a raised surface that was then covered with willow branches, heather or other plant material, and finally with thick layers of caribou skins. The platform was typically 3 or 4 feet above the floor level, placing the occupants in the warmest zone of the igloo. A ventilation hole was cut near the top of the dome. This was essential. Burning seal oil, like any combustion, consumed oxygen and produced carbon dioxide. Without ventilation, the air inside the igloo would become stale and potentially dangerous. The hole allowed fresh air to enter and carbon dioxide to escape, creating a gentle circulation that kept the air breathable without creating a strong draft. The interior temperature of an occupied igloo was startlingly warm compared to the outside. While the exterior air might be 40 degrees below 0 Celsius, the inside of the igloo, warmed by the qulliq and by the body heat of the people inside, could reach 5, 10, or even 15 degrees Celsius, temperatures in the range of 40 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This warmth had an interesting secondary effect. The inner surface of the snow walls would begin to melt slightly from the heat. A thin layer of water would form on the interior surface of the blocks, but the outer portion of the blocks, exposed to the frigid exterior air, remained frozen. The water on the inside would then refreeze, creating a smooth, glassy coating of ice on the interior walls. This ice glaze served multiple purposes. It sealed any tiny gaps or cracks between blocks, making the igloo more airtight. It strengthened the structure, turning the snow into a harder, more durable material. And it created a smooth, reflective surface that caught and amplified the light from the qulliq, making the interior brighter. The igloo, in this state, was not just a pile of snow blocks. It was a living structure, breathing and adjusting to the balance of heat and cold, constantly reinforcing itself. It was the product of deep understanding, an understanding of materials, of physics, of the behavior of heat and air, all developed without formal scientific knowledge, all refined through observation, experimentation, and the accumulated experience of generations. And it was, in its quiet way, a masterpiece. a shelter built from the very material that defined the harshness of the environment, snow and ice, transformed into a space of warmth, safety, and comfort. It was not resistance to the cold. It was collaboration with it, an acceptance of the conditions and a careful, intelligent response that turned the frozen world into a home. The igloo's effectiveness was not magic, though to an outside observer it might have seemed that way. It was the result of physics, specifically the behaviour of heat, air and insulation, applied with precision. Heat moves in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. The igloo, in its design and construction, addressed all three. Conduction is the transfer of heat through a solid material. When a warm object touches a cold object, heat flows from the warm object to the cold one until they reach the same temperature. In the context of the igloo, conduction would occur through the snow walls, with heat from the interior trying to escape to the exterior. But snow, because of its structure, is a poor conductor of heat. The trapped air inside the snow blocks does not allow heat to move through it efficiently. Air itself is an excellent insulator, and the snow's porous structure keeps this air in place, preventing convection within the material. The result is that the snow blocks act as a thick, effective barrier against conductive heat loss. The thickness of the walls, typically 6 inches or more, further reduced conduction. The greater the thickness of an insulating material, the more slowly heat moves through it. The igloo's dome shape also meant that the surface area of the walls was minimized relative to the interior volume, reducing the total area through which heat could escape. Convection is the transfer of heat through the movement of air or fluid. Warm air rises, cold air sinks, and if there is a pathway for this air to circulate, heat can be lost quickly. This is why a drafty room feels colder than a sealed one, even if the temperature is technically the same. The igloo addressed convection through its entrance design. The cold trap, the U-shaped tunnel, prevented a continuous flow of air between the interior and the exterior. Cold air entering the tunnel would sink to the lowest point and remain there, pooled and stagnant. Warm air inside the main dome would rise to the top, where the sleeping platform was located, and would not flow out through the entrance because it was physically blocked by the tunnel's shape. The ventilation hole at the top of the dome did allow some air exchange, but it was small and positioned in a way that did not create a strong draft. The circulation it provided was gentle, sufficient to maintain breathable air, but not strong enough to carry away significant amounts of heat. Radiation is the transfer of heat through electromagnetic waves. All objects emit infrared radiation, heat energy that radiates outward from their surface. A human body, for instance, constantly radiates heat into the surrounding environment, which is why a person feels cold in a frigid room even if the air is still. The igloo addressed radiation in a subtle way. The ice glaze on the interior walls, which formed from the melting and refreezing process, was slightly reflective. This meant that some of the infrared radiation, emitted by the occupants and by the qulliq lamp, was reflected back into the living space rather than being absorbed by the walls and conducted away. The effect was small but measurable, contributing to the overall warmth of the interior. Additionally, the small size of the igloo meant that the occupants were close to each other and to the lamp. In a large open space, much of the radiated heat would be lost to the surrounding air and surfaces. In the compact interior of the igloo, almost all of the heat stayed within the occupied zone. The sleeping platform raised above the floor was positioned in the warmest part of the igloo. Warm air, being less dense than cold air, rises naturally. The stratification of air temperature inside the igloo was significant. The floor level, where the entrance tunnel opened, might be only slightly above freezing, perhaps 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. The middle zone, at standing height, might be 5 to 10 degrees. But the upper zone, where the platform was located, could be 10 to 15 degrees, or even warmer. This meant that the occupants, lying on the platform and covered with caribou skins, were in a microclimate that was remarkably comfortable. The temperature was cool by the standards of a heated modern home, but it was warm enough to sleep without discomfort, warm enough to work on tasks like sewing or tool repair, warm enough to eat and socialise without the constant pressing awareness of the cold. The caribou skins covering the platform added another layer of insulation. These were not simply blankets. They were thick, dense layers of fur, often several skins deep, creating a soft, warm surface that trapped body heat and prevented it from being lost to the snow platform below. The The igloo also provided protection from wind, which is often more dangerous than cold alone. Wind accelerates heat loss from the body through a process called convective cooling. Even a moderate wind can make a cold temperature feel much colder and can lead to frostbite or hypothermia much more quickly than still air at the same temperature. Inside the igloo, there was no wind. The air was still, warm and calm. This stillness was as important as the temperature itself. A person could sit comfortably in the igloo's interior at a temperature that would be dangerously cold if they were exposed to wind outside. The construction time for an igloo varied depending on the builder's skill and the number of people helping. An experienced builder, working alone, could complete a small, functional igloo in 1 to 2 hours. Larger structures, or those built with more attention to detail and comfort, might take half a day. For temporary shelters during a hunting trip, speed was essential, and even a rough igloo built in under an hour could provide life-saving protection from a sudden storm. The igloo's portability, or rather, its ease of construction and abandonment, was another advantage. If a family needed to move to follow game or to join another group, they simply left the igloo and built a new one at their destination. The snow was always available. The knowledge was carried in the mind. No materials needed to be transported except the tools, a knife, and perhaps an ice pick for widening seal breathing holes or for shaping blocks. This was not a culture that accumulated permanent structures or invested heavily in fixed locations. The igloo embodied a philosophy of mobility, adaptability, and resourcefulness. It was a shelter that existed in harmony with the environment rather than in opposition to it, using the cold itself as a building material, turning the landscape's harshness into a protective shell. And it worked. For thousands of years, the igloo provided safe, warm shelter in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. It was not perfect. No shelter is, but it was remarkably effective, a testament to human ingenuity and the power of careful observation and accumulated knowledge. The transition from the outside to the inside of an igloo was not gradual. It was immediate and striking. A person crawling through the low entrance tunnel would move from a world of biting cold, wind and darkness into a world of warmth, stillness and soft light. The contrast was profound. Outside, at 40 degrees below zero, exposed skin would begin to freeze in minutes. Breath would form clouds of ice crystals. Movement was necessary to generate body heat, and stillness meant cold seeping through even the best clothing. The wind, if it was blowing, would cut through layers, finding gaps, stealing warmth. Inside the igloo, all of that stopped. The first thing a person would notice, after the visual adjustment to the dim, flickering light of the qulliq, was the absence of wind. The air was completely still. There was no draft, no movement, no sense of exposure. The stillness itself felt protective, like a blanket wrapped around the body. The second thing was the temperature. It was not warm by the standards of a modern heated room, but compared to the exterior, it felt almost shockingly comfortable. The air was cool but not biting. A person could breathe without pain, without the sensation of cold air burning in the lungs. Exposed skin did not sting or go numb. The third thing was the light. The qulliq burned steadily, its flame small but constant, casting a soft golden glow across the interior. The ice-glazed walls caught this light and reflected it, amplifying it, making the small space brighter than it would otherwise be. The light was warm in colour, yellows and oranges, and it created shadows that were gentle and diffuse rather than harsh. The igloo's interior was a compact, efficient space. The floor was snow, packed firm. The walls curved upward and inward, creating the dome. The ceiling at the highest point might be 5 or 6 feet above the floor, but near the edges the height was lower, forcing occupants to duck or crawl. The sleeping platform dominated the space. It was a raised area, built from snow blocks and covered with layers of plant material and caribou skins. It might extend along one side of the igloo, or it might form a horseshoe shape, wrapping around 2 or 3 sides depending on the size of the dwelling and the number of occupants. This platform was the heart of the igloo. It was where people slept, sat, worked, and socialized. It was the warmest zone, the most comfortable area, and the place where life inside the igloo was centered. The qulliq lamp sat in front of the platform, often on a slightly lower level of snow. It was tended constantly, a task that required attention and skill. The woman of the house would sit near the lamp, adjusting the moss wick with a small hook tool made of bone or antler. She would trim the wick, move it, shape it, ensuring that the flame burned cleanly and evenly. Too much wick exposed, and the flame would smoke, wasting fuel and filling the igloo with soot. Too little, and the flame would dim or go out, plunging the space into cold and darkness. The lamp's fuel, rendered seal or whale blubber, was stored in containers, often made from seal skin or carved from stone. The blubber was a thick, oily substance, and it burned slowly, releasing a steady supply of heat and light. A single seal could provide enough blubber to keep a lamp burning for days or even weeks, depending on the size of the animal and the efficiency of the lamp. Above the lamp, a wooden or bone rack was often suspended. This rack served multiple purposes. It could hold a soapstone pot used to melt snow for drinking water, a constant essential task, as eating snow directly would lower body temperature and lead to dehydration. The pot would sit just above the flame, the heat slowly melting the snow and warming the water to a drinkable temperature. The rack was also used to dry clothing. Wet clothing in the Arctic was a serious danger. Moisture in fabric would freeze, destroying the insulation and leading quickly to frostbite and hypothermia. Every day, after a hunt or any activity outside, the hunter's mittens, bootliners and socks would be damp with sweat or condensation. These items would be hung above the qulliq, where the rising heat would dry them slowly and thoroughly. This drying process was critical. It was not optional or secondary. It was as important as the lamp's light or heat. Without dry clothing, survival outside was impossible, and without the lamp's drying warmth, clothing could not be kept dry. The lamp, in this sense, was the technological linchpin of Arctic survival. The igloo's interior was not silent, but the sounds were domestic and quiet. There was the faint crackle of the lamp's flame, the occasional hiss of melting snow, the soft murmur of conversation, the rustle of caribou hides as someone shifted position. Children might play quietly, or sleep, curled up on the platform under skins. Dogs, if they were allowed inside, would lie near the entrance, their warmth adding to the overall heat of the space. The air inside the igloo had a particular smell. It was the smell of seal oil burning, a slightly fishy, oily scent that was not unpleasant to those accustomed to it. There was the smell of caribou fur, the smell of human bodies in close quarters, the faint smell of snow and cold air carried in from outside. It was a smell that spoke of life, of warmth, of survival. The igloo's walls from the inside were smooth and slightly translucent where the ice glaze had formed. In daylight, if the sun's twilight glow was strong enough, a faint, diffuse light would filter through the walls, giving the interior a soft, bluish illumination. At night, or during the deep darkness of the new moon, the only light came from the lamp, and the walls appeared opaque, a solid barrier between the warm interior and the cold exterior. The space was small, intimate, and shared. Privacy, in the modern sense, did not exist. Families lived in close proximity, sleeping side by side, working together, eating together. This closeness was not a hardship. It was the norm, the expected condition of life. Personal space was not a concept that had much relevance in a world where survival depended on cooperation and shared warmth. But this closeness also created a need for social harmony. In a space where there was no room to retreat, where every sound and movement was shared, the ability to get along, to manage conflicts, to maintain respect and cooperation, was essential. The Inuit social structure, with its emphasis on sharing, on consensus, on avoiding direct confrontation, was in part a response to the physical realities of living in such close quarters. The igloo was more than just a shelter. It was a social space, a workspace, a place of rest, and a barrier against a world that was, without it, lethal. It was the centre of life during the polar night, the place where the long hours of darkness were passed, where warmth was maintained, where food was prepared and eaten, where stories were told, where children learned, where the community gathered, and it was effective. Despite its simplicity, despite being built from nothing but snow and the knowledge carried in the builder's mind, the igloo provided a level of comfort and safety that was remarkable. It was a testament to the Inuits' deep understanding of their environment their ability to see potential in what others might see only as a hostile wasteland, and their capacity to create a home even in the most extreme conditions. The cold fell away at the entrance. Inside, life continued warm and steady through the long months of darkness. The qulliq was not simply a lamp. To describe it that way is to miss its central importance. It was the sun, the stove, the heater, and the dryer, all in one. It was the piece of technology that made human life possible in the Arctic winter, and its maintenance was one of the most skilled and important tasks in Inuit society. The lamp itself was a simple object in form, a shallow crescent-shaped bowl carved from soapstone. Soapstone, also called steatite, was chosen for specific reasons. It was soft enough to be shaped with basic tools, but it was also highly heat-resistant. It would not crack or shatter when exposed to the constant heat of a flame. It retained warmth, slowly releasing it even after the flame had been lowered or extinguished. The size of the qulliq varied depending on its purpose and the size of the household. A small lamp might be 8 to 10 inches long. A larger one, meant to heat and light a dwelling for an extended family, might be 2 feet or more across. The depth was shallow, typically only a few inches, and the crescent shape was consistent, with one straight edge and one curved edge. The fuel was rendered blubber, usually from seals, though whale blubber or walrus blubber could also be used depending on availability. The blubber was not simply placed into the lamp as a solid mass. It had to be prepared. The raw blubber would be cut into small pieces and gently warmed, or pounded to release its oil. This oil was then poured into the lamp, filling the shallow bowl. The wick was not a cord or string. It was a carefully prepared collection of Arctic cotton, a type of moss that grew in the tundra during the brief summer, or a specific kind of absorbent moss called qulliq. This material was gathered in summer, dried, and stored for winter use. The wick would be placed along the straight edge of the crescent-shaped lamp, soaking up the oil. The length of the wick could be adjusted, spread out along the entire straight edge, or concentrated in a smaller area, depending on how much light and heat were needed. Lighting the lamp initially required either a spark from striking flint, or more commonly, the transfer of flame from another lamp, or from embers carried from a previous fire. Once lit, the flame was maintained continuously if possible. Letting the lamp go out meant having to relight it, and this was a waste of time and fuel. The flame, when properly tended, burned cleanly with very little smoke. This was the mark of skill. A poorly maintained lamp would produce thick black smoke that would fill the igloo, blackening the walls, irritating the eyes and lungs, and wasting the precious oil. A well-tended lamp produced a clear, steady flame that gave light and heat without smoke. Tending the lamp was the responsibility of the woman of the household, and it was a continuous task. The wick had to be trimmed and adjusted constantly. If the moss became charred or saturated, it had to be replaced with fresh material. The flame height had to be monitored and controlled. The oil level had to be maintained, with more blubber added as it was consumed. This work required focus, experience, and a deep understanding of how the lamp behaved. A skilled woman could tell, by the colour and shape of the flame, whether it was burning correctly. She could adjust the wick with minute precision, using a small hooked tool called a takut, made from bone or antler. The movements were small, careful, practiced. Trim here, shift there, add a little more oil, pull the wick back slightly. This was not a task that could be neglected or done carelessly. The lamp was life. If it went out, the igloo would grow cold within hours. If it smoked excessively, the air would become unbreathable. If it consumed too much fuel too quickly, the family might run out of oil before the hunting could replenish the supply. The woman tending the lamp carried a heavy responsibility, and the skill with which she performed this task was a measure of her competence and value to the household. But the lamp's importance went beyond just light and heat. The rack or platform suspended above the flame served multiple critical functions. First, it was used for melting snow. Water was essential, but there were no liquid sources of water in winter. Everything was frozen. Snow had to be melted, and this was done constantly. A soapstone pot would be filled with clean snow and placed on the rack above the flame. The heat would slowly melt the snow into water, which could then be drunk or used for cooking. Eating snow directly was dangerous. Snow is much colder than body temperature, and consuming it forces the body to expend significant energy, to warm it internally. This lowers core body temperature and can contribute to hypothermia. Melting snow first and warming the water before drinking it was essential. Second, the rack was used for warming food. Much of the Inuit diet was eaten raw. Frozen fish, frozen meat, frozen blubber. These foods were nutritious and safe to eat without cooking. But sometimes a warm meal was desired, both for comfort and for the additional calories that could be extracted from cooked food. Meat or fish could be placed on the rack or in a pot and gently warmed by the lamp's heat. Third, and perhaps most critically, the rack was used for drying clothing. This function cannot be overstated. Wet clothing in the Arctic was a death sentence. Moisture in fabric destroyed its insulating properties. Water conducts heat far more efficiently than air, and wet fabric against the skin would pull warmth away from the body at a dangerous rate. When the moisture froze, as it inevitably would, the clothing became stiff, uncomfortable, and completely ineffective. After any activity outside, hunting, travelling, even just a short walk to visit a neighbour, a person's inner clothing would be damp with sweat. The body produced heat through exertion, and this heat, trapped by the insulating layers, would cause perspiration. The moisture would be absorbed by the caribou fur, by the boot liners, by the mittens. These items had to be dried, and the only reliable way to dry them was with the warmth of the qulliq. Mittens, socks, boot liners, and sometimes even the inner parka would be hung on the rack above the flame. The rising heat would slowly evaporate the moisture, and the items would be ready to use again the next day. This drying process took time. It could not be rushed. The heat from the lamp was gentle, and forcing the process by bringing items too close to the flame would risk scorching or damaging them. The woman tending the lamp would manage this process along with everything else, adjusting the position of the clothing, turning items to ensure even drying, monitoring the flame to ensure consistent heat. The lamp also provided a psychological function that is harder to quantify, but no less important. It was a source of comfort. The soft, warm glow of the flame in the darkness of the polar night was a constant presence. It was life, warmth, safety. It was the heart of the home, and its steady light was a reminder that the cold and darkness outside were held at bay. Families would gather near the lamp. Children would play in its glow. Elders would sit close to it, warming their hands, watching the flame. Stories would be told in its light. Work would be done by it. Sewing, tool repair, the preparation of hides or sinew. The lamp was the centre around which life in the igloo revolved. The fuel for the lamp, the seal blubber, came from the hunt, and this created a direct visible link between the outside world and the interior comfort. The hunter, standing motionless on the ice, waiting for a seal, was not just hunting for food. He was hunting for light, for heat, for the ability to dry clothing. The seal's blubber, rendered and poured into the qulliq, was the substance that allowed the family to survive. This connection was understood and respected. The seal was not just a resource, it was a giver of life, and the Inuit treated it accordingly. When a seal was taken, it was thanked, often with words or gestures. Its body was used completely, with respect and care. Nothing was wasted, and the lamp burning with the seal's oil was a daily reminder of this relationship. The qulliq burned continuously, day and night, through the weeks and months of the polar night. It was the heart of the home, the source of light and warmth, the centre of family life. It was simple in form, just stone, oil and moss, but it was profound in function. It was the technology that turned the Arctic from an uninhabitable frozen wasteland into a place where people could live, and live well. Maintaining the qulliq was not a passive task. It required constant attention, precise judgment, and a level of skill that took years to develop. It was work that was never finished, a discipline that defined the rhythm of daily life inside the igloo. The flame could not be left unattended for long. If the wick burned down too far, the flame would dim and might go out completely. If the wick was exposed too much, the flame would flare up, consuming oil rapidly and producing smoke. The balance had to be maintained constantly. This meant that someone, almost always the woman of the household, had to be present or nearby at all times. Even during sleep, the lamp continued to burn, and someone would wake periodically to check on it, to trim the wick, to add more oil if needed. The tool used for this work was the taqut, a small hooked implement carved from bone or antler. Its design was simple but effective. A handle, usually 4 to 6 inches long, with a small hook or curved tip at one end. This hook was used to lift the edge of the moss wick, to move it along the edge of the lamp, to trim away charred sections, and to adjust the wick's position to control the flame's height and intensity. The movements required were small and precise. The wick was delicate, and a rough handling would tear it or dislodge it entirely. The woman would sit by the lamp, the taqut in hand, and make continuous small adjustments. A gentle lift here, a slight shift there, a careful pinch to remove a piece of charred moss. It was work that required focus and practice, a skill passed down from mother to daughter, learned through observation and repetition. The colour and behaviour of the flame provided information. A clean, steady flame, pale yellow or orange in colour, indicated that the lamp was burning efficiently. The wick was properly positioned, the oil was flowing correctly, and the air circulation in the igloo was adequate. A flame that flickered or danced might indicate a draught. A small gap in the igloo's walls or entrance that was allowing air to flow through. This would need to be addressed, either by packing snow into the gap or by adjusting the entrance covering. A flame that was too tall and bright, with a reddish tint, indicated that too much wick was exposed. This was wasteful. The oil was being consumed too quickly, and the flame was producing excess heat that was not needed. The wick would need to be trimmed or pulled back. A flame that was weak, dim, or blue-tinged indicated incomplete combustion. This could mean that the oil level was too low, that the wick was saturated and needed to be replaced, or that the ventilation hole at the top of the igloo was blocked, restricting the oxygen supply. Each of these issues required a different response, and the woman tending the lamp had to diagnose the problem and act accordingly. Smoke was the enemy. A lamp that produced smoke was a problem. Smoke blackened the interior of the igloo, coating the ice-glazed walls, with soot and reducing the amount of light reflected. Smoke irritated the eyes and lungs, causing discomfort and, over time, health problems. Smoke also indicated waste. The oil was not burning completely, and the carbon in the fuel was being released as particulate matter rather than being converted to heat and light. A skilled woman could maintain a lamp that burned with almost no smoke. This was the goal, the mark of competence. Visitors to an igloo would notice immediately whether the lamp was well tended or not. A clean, bright interior with a steady flame was a source of pride. A smoky, dim interior was a sign of poor maintenance. The work was constant, but it was not arduous in the sense of physical labour. It was mentally demanding, requiring attention and care, but the movements themselves were small and repetitive. It was work that could be done while sitting, while talking, while watching children, while listening to stories. It fit into the flow of daily life, a background task that was always present. But it was also work that could not be neglected. The consequences of a poorly maintained lamp were immediate and serious. A lamp that went out meant cold, darkness, and the inability to dry clothing. In the deep winter, with no other source of light or heat readily available, relighting a lamp was difficult and potentially dangerous. Embers or flame had to be carried from another igloo, or created from scratch with flint and tinder, a process that was time-consuming and not always successful in the extreme cold. Running out of fuel was an even more serious problem. If the blubber supply was exhausted before new seals could be hunted, the family faced a crisis. Without the lamp, survival in the igloo became uncertain. The cold would seep in, the darkness would be complete, and the ability to maintain dry clothing would be lost. This created pressure on the hunters. The lamp's fuel had to be replenished regularly, and this meant that hunting was not optional. It was a necessity, driven by the constant daily consumption of oil. A successful hunt provided not just food but the fuel that sustained the entire household. The lamp was the link between the exterior world of hunting and the interior world of warmth and light. The woman's role as the tender of the lamp gave her significant status and responsibility within the household. The lamp was life, and she was its keeper. Her skill, her attention, her ability to maintain the flame cleanly and efficiently determined the comfort and safety of the entire family. It was a role that was respected and valued, a contribution that was as essential as the hunter's work on the ice. In some ways, the lamp was the centre of a gendered division of labour that was practical and balanced. Men hunted, bringing in the seals, the caribou, the materials needed for survival. Women prepared these materials, turning raw hides into clothing, raw blubber into oil, and then maintained the lamp that provided warmth and light. Both roles were essential. Neither could succeed without the other, but this division was not rigid. In times of need, roles could be flexible. A woman might hunt, or a man might tend the lamp. The Inuit were pragmatic. Survival took precedence over strict adherence to social norms. What mattered was that the work was done, that the lamp stayed lit, that the family stayed warm. The lamp's discipline was also a discipline of patience. The flame burned slowly. The oil was consumed gradually. There was no way to rush the process, no way to speed up the melting of snow or the drying of clothing. Everything happened at the lamp's pace, and the people living by its light adapted their rhythm to match. This slowness was, in a sense, a reflection of the polar night itself. The darkness lasted for months. The sun's return was not something that could be hurried. The world moved slowly, and life moved with it. The lamp burning steadily through the long weeks was a physical manifestation of this patience, this acceptance of time's slow passage. And so the woman would sit, the takut in hand, adjusting the wick, watching the flame, maintaining the light. It was work that was never dramatic, never celebrated in the way a successful hunt might be, but it was work that was absolutely essential. The lamp was the heart of the home, and its steady, smokeless flame was the product of constant, careful, disciplined attention. The lamp depended on fuel, and fuel came from seals. This simple fact meant that hunting was not a choice or a hobby. It was a necessity repeated throughout the winter, a quiet but constant effort that sustained life inside the igloo. The hunt in the polar night was different from the summer hunt. In summer, seals could be hunted from kayaks on open water, or they could be stalked as they rested on the ice. But in winter, the sea was frozen solid, and the seals lived beneath the ice, swimming in the cold, dark water, rising only to breathe. The key to winter seal hunting was the breathing hole, called an igloo. These were small openings in the ice, roughly the size of a dinner plate, kept clear by the seals themselves. A seal would use its claws and the warmth of its breath to prevent a hole from freezing over completely, and it would return to the same holes repeatedly throughout the winter. Finding these holes was the first challenge. On the vast expanse of sea ice, with snow covering much of the surface, breathing holes were nearly invisible. They were often marked by a slight dome of frost, created by the seal's warm breath freezing on contact with the cold air. This dome might be only a few inches high, and it could easily be mistaken for a natural irregularity in the snow. Some hunters used dogs to help locate breathing holes. A trained dog could smell the seal's breath rising from the hole even when it was covered by snow. The dog would sniff the ice, moving in a search pattern, and when it found a hole, it would stop and indicate the location. Not all dogs had this skill, and those that did were highly valued. Other hunters relied on their own observation and experience. They would search for the subtle signs, a faint discoloration in the snow, a slight depression, a texture that indicated the presence of a hole beneath. They would walk slowly across the ice, scanning constantly, looking for the telltale markers. Once a hole was found, the hunter faced the wait. This wait was the heart of the winter hunt. It was not dramatic. There was no chase, no struggle, no immediate action. There was only patience, stillness, and cold. The hunter would position himself near the hole. He might build a small, low wall of snow blocks as a windbreak, just high enough to block the wind, but not so high that it would interfere with his strike. He would stand, or sometimes sit on a block of ice or a folded caribou skin, holding his harpoon ready. The harpoon was a specialized tool. It consisted of a long shaft, usually made of wood or bone, with a detachable head. The head was carved from ivory or bone, and it had a sharp point and barbs. Attached to the head was a long line, made of sealskin or braided sinew. When the harpoon struck a seal, the head would penetrate the animal's body, and then the barbs would turn sideways, locking the head inside. The seal could not escape, and the hunter could pull it up through the hole using the line. The hunter would hold the harpoon with both hands, point downward, ready to strike, and then he would wait. The cold during these waits was severe. Temperatures of 30, 40, even 50 degrees below zero were not uncommon during the deep winter. A person standing still, even in the best clothing, would begin to lose body heat. The caribou fur provided excellent insulation, but it could not generate heat. That had to come from the body itself, and without movement, the body's heat production slowed. Frostbite was a constant risk. Fingers, toes, nose, ears, any exposed or poorly insulated area could freeze. The hunter had to monitor his own body constantly, flexing fingers inside mittens, wiggling toes inside boots, checking for numbness or pain that indicated the onset of freezing tissue. But he could not move too much. Any vibration transmitted through the ice would alert the seal below. Seals were cautious animals, highly attuned to danger. They could hear through the ice, and they could sense vibrations. A hunter who stamped his feet to stay warm, or who shifted his weight frequently, would drive the seal away. So the hunter remained still. He stood, or sat, with the harpoon ready, breathing slowly, listening. The sound of a seal rising to breathe was faint, a soft exhalation, a gentle splash. The hunter had to hear it, identify it, and act immediately. The waiting was not empty time. The hunter's awareness during these hours became heightened in ways that are difficult to describe. With no distractions, no conversation, no movement, the senses sharpened. He would hear things that would otherwise be inaudible, the faint groaning of ice far in the distance, a sound that might indicate pressure building or a lead opening, the subtle shift of wind direction, detectable by a change in how the cold felt on exposed skin, the movement of stars across the sky, imperceptibly slow, moment to moment, but visible over the course of an hour. His eyes would adjust to the darkness, becoming sensitive to the faintest variations in light. Under a full moon he could see the texture of the snow, the slight irregularities in the ice, the faint shadow cast by his own body. Under a new moon, with only starlight, the world became nearly monochromatic, but shapes were still distinguishable. The horizon, a distant pressure ridge, the dark patch where open water might be forming. He would feel the cold working its way through his clothing, despite the caribou fur's insulation. His toes would begin to go numb first, always the toes. He would flex them inside his boots, trying to maintain circulation without moving his feet and transmitting vibration through the ice. His fingers, wrapped around the harpoon shaft, would ache. He might shift the harpoon from one hand to the other, tucking the free hand inside his parka against his body for a few moments of warmth, then switching back. The cold also brought clarity. The mind, perhaps because of the discomfort or perhaps because of the sensory deprivation, would enter a state that was both alert and meditative. Thoughts would come and go, memories would surface, a successful hunt from years ago, the face of a child, the taste of fresh seal meat. But these thoughts did not demand attention. They floated, observed, and passed. Time became difficult to measure. Without movement or change, minutes felt like hours, or hours felt like minutes. The hunter might think he had been waiting for only a short while, and then look at the stars and realize they had moved significantly. Or he might feel that hours had passed, and yet the moon was barely higher than when he arrived. The strike was quick. The hunter would drive the harpoon downward, aiming for the center of the hole, hoping to hit the seal's body beneath. The hole itself was small, and the seal's head and upper body would fill much of it. If the strike was accurate, the harpoon would penetrate, the toggle head would turn, and the seal would be hooked. If the strike missed, the seal would dive instantly, disappearing into the dark water beneath the ice. It might not return to that hole for hours, or it might return to a different hole entirely. The hunter would not know. He could only wait and hope. If the strike was successful, the hunter's work was just beginning. He would drop the harpoon shaft and grab the line, holding it firmly. The seal, underwater, would struggle. It was a strong animal, and it would pull against the line, trying to escape. The hunter had to hold on, letting the seal tire itself, waiting for the right moment. When the seal's struggles weakened, the hunter would begin to pull. The line would come up slowly, hand over hand, and the seal's body would appear at the hole. The hole was too small for the seal to fit through easily, so the hunter would use an ice pick or a knife to widen it, chipping away at the edges, enlarging the opening. Finally, the seal would be pulled up onto the ice, a dark, sleek body, limp and still. The hunter would acknowledge the animal, sometimes speaking a few words of thanks or respect. This was not sentimentality. It was recognition of the relationship between hunter and prey, the understanding that the seal had given its life, and that this gift should not be taken lightly. The seal would be butchered on the ice. The blubber would be cut away in thick strips, carefully removed to preserve as much as possible. The meat would be sectioned, some for immediate use, some to be cached for later. The skin would be kept intact if possible, to be used for clothing or other purposes. The bones, the organs, the blood, everything had use. The blubber was the prize for the lamp. It would be loaded onto a sled or carried back to the camp. Back at the igloo it would be rendered, cut into small pieces, warmed or pounded to release the oil, and then added to the qulliq. The lamp would burn, the igloo would stay warm, and life would continue. But not every hunt ended with a seal. Many times, the hunter would wait for hours and return empty-handed. The seal might not return to that particular hole. It might sense danger and avoid it. The hunter might hear the seal's breath but miss the strike. The variables were many, and success was never guaranteed. There were hunts that ended in failure for reasons beyond the hunter's control. A polar bear, smelling the seal or the hunter himself, might approach. The hunter would see the white shape moving across the ice, distinctive in its size and gait, and he would have to make a decision. A polar bear was dangerous, especially if it was hungry. Facing one with only a harpoon was risky. Most hunters would retreat, abandoning the breathing hole for the day, allowing the bear to take precedence. Sometimes the ice itself would become unsafe. A crack might form, running across the area where the hunter stood. He would hear it before he saw it, a sharp report, then a rumbling sound as the crack extended. He would move quickly then, stepping away from the crack, assessing whether the ice plate he was on was stable or drifting. If it was drifting, if the crack had created a new, separate piece of ice, he would have to find a way back to stable ice, jumping across the crack or finding a place where it was narrow enough to cross. Weather could also end a hunt. A wind might pick up suddenly, driving snow horizontally across the ice, reducing visibility to nothing. In whiteout conditions, a hunter could become disoriented, losing track of which direction was which, unable to see landmarks or even his own footprints. The safest choice was to build a small emergency shelter, a quick, rough snow wall or even a snow cave, and wait for the storm to pass. The journey back to camp after a successful hunt was its own experience. The seal, depending on its size, might weigh anywhere from 40 to 100 pounds or more. If the hunter had a sled, he would load the seal onto it and pull. If not, he would carry it, the body slung across his shoulders, the weight significant but bearable. The distance back to the igloo might be a few hundred yards or several miles, depending on where the breathing hole was located. Walking with the weight, the hunter would feel the effort in his legs, in his back, in his lungs. His breathing would quicken, his body would generate heat, and he would have to manage his clothing to prevent sweating. He might open his parka, letting cold air in to cool himself. He might stop periodically to rest, setting the seal down, catching his breath, and then continuing. The sight of the camp, the faint glow of lamps visible through the snow walls of the igloos, or the darker shapes of the structures themselves against the snow, was always a point of relief. He was returning with food, with fuel. The family would be sustained. The wait, the cold, the hours of stillness had been worth it. This was accepted. The Inuit did not see the hunt as a test of dominance or a competition to be won. They saw it as a relationship, a negotiation between human and animal, mediated by skill, patience, and luck. These seals gave themselves when they chose to. The hunter could only prepare, wait, and act when the opportunity came, and so the cycle continued. The hunter would go out onto the ice bower, find a breathing hole, and wait. He might return with a seal, or he might return with nothing. The lamp would burn through the blubber already stored, and when supplies ran low, the hunter would go out again. It was a rhythm, a cycle of hunting and return, of fuel consumed and fuel replenished, that lasted through the long months of darkness. The hunt was quiet, patient, and essential. It was the outer work that made the inner warmth possible. The hunter on the ice and the woman tending the lamp were linked, their efforts interdependent, both necessary for survival in the polar night. The igloo provided shelter, and the qulliq provided warmth and light, But the Inuit's survival in the polar night also depended on something more personal and immediate: clothing. The garments they wore were not just coverings. They were a life support system, a portable environment that allowed the human body to function in conditions that would otherwise be lethal within minutes. The key to this clothing system was insulation, and the key to insulation was trapped air. The principle was the same as the snow igloo. Air, when held still, is an excellent insulator. The challenge was to create clothing that could trap large amounts of air close to the body, while also being flexible, durable, and manageable. The material of choice was caribou fur, and the reason was its unique structure. Each hair on a caribou's winter coat is hollow, a tiny microscopic tube filled with air. This gives the fur an extraordinarily high insulation-to-weight ratio. The hairs are also densely packed, with thousands of them per square inch, creating a thick, soft layer that traps even more air between the individual hairs. Caribou fur, in terms of insulating efficiency, is unmatched by almost any natural or synthetic material even today. Modern insulation technologies, like down feathers or synthetic fibers, work on the same principle, trapping air. But caribou fur does it with a combination of lightness, flexibility, and warmth that is difficult to replicate. Sealskin was also used, but for different reasons. Sealskin is tough, waterproof, and wind-resistant, but it is not as warm as caribou. It was used primarily for outer garments, for boots, and for items that needed to resist moisture or abrasion. Sealskin boots, for example, were essential for walking on ice and snow, where waterproofing was critical. The Inuit clothing system was based on layering, and this layering was precise. A person would wear 2 full suits of caribou clothing, an inner suit and an outer suit. Each suit consisted of a parka, a long coat with a hood, trousers, boots, and mittens. The inner suit, called igloos, was worn with the fur facing inward, touching the skin. This placement was critical. The soft, dense fur created a layer of warm air directly against the body. This air, heated by the body's own metabolism, was trapped by the fur and held close, forming a personal envelope of warmth. The outer suit, called qulliq, was worn with the fur facing outward. This outer layer served multiple purposes. The fur, facing outward, acted as a natural insulator and also shed snow and moisture. Snow that fell on the outer fur could be brushed off easily, preventing it from melting and soaking into the clothing. The outer fur also blocked wind, which was essential. Even the best insulation loses effectiveness if air can move through it, carrying heat away. Between the inner and outer suits there was a gap, a space where air could circulate. This circulation was important for moisture management. The human body produces heat, and with heat comes moisture in the form of sweat. Even in extreme cold, the body will perspire if it is active. This moisture had to be managed, or it would accumulate in the clothing and freeze, destroying the insulation. The loose fit of the clothing allowed this moisture to escape gradually, moving from the inner layer to the outer layer, and then evaporating into the cold, dry air. It was not a perfect system. Some moisture would still accumulate, but it was effective enough to prevent the dangerous build-up that would occur in tight-fitting clothing. The parka was the central garment. It was long, extending down to the thighs or knees, with a hood that could be pulled tight around the face. The hood was critical. Heat loss from the head is significant, and protecting the head and face from cold and wind was essential. The fur around the hood's edge was often wolverine or wolf fur. These furs have a special property. They do not collect frost. When a person breathes in extreme cold, the moisture in their breath freezes almost instantly, forming ice crystals. These crystals, if they accumulate on the fur around the face, can create a dangerous build-up of ice, blocking vision and making it difficult to breathe. Wolverine and wolf fur shed this frost easily, allowing it to be brushed away without clinging. For women, the parka often had an additional feature, the amout, a large pouch on the back. This pouch was designed to carry a baby or small child. The child would be placed in the pouch naked, against the mother's bare back, sharing her body heat. The mother's warmth, trapped by the caribou fur, would keep the child warm even in the coldest conditions. This system was remarkably effective, and it allowed mothers to care for infants while still moving and working outside. The trousers were also double-layered, inner and outer, made of caribou fur. They were cut loosely, allowing freedom of movement and air circulation. They extended from the waist to the ankles, where they would be tucked into boots or tied to keep cold air from entering. The boots, called qulliq, were complex multi-part creations. The outer boot was made of sealskin, which was waterproof and durable. The inner boot, or liner, was made of soft caribou fur or Arctic hare fur, providing insulation. The soles of the outer boots were also sealskin, often with the fur facing outward to provide traction on ice. The fit of the boots was important. They had to be large enough to allow for thick inner liners and for air circulation, but not so loose that they would slip off or allow cold air to enter. The seams had to be watertight, sewn with incredible precision using bone needles and sinew thread. A single leak, a single poorly sewn seam, could allow moisture to enter, and wet feet in the Arctic were a serious danger. The sewing of these garments was work that required extraordinary skill and precision. Women used needles made from bone, typically from birds, whose bones were small and fine, or from ivory. These needles were carved and shaped by hand, sharpened to a fine point and polished smooth. The eye of the needle, the hole through which the sinew thread would pass, was drilled using a bow drill, a painstaking process that could take hours for a single needle. The thread itself was made from caribou sinew, the tough, fibrous tissue from the animal's back and legs. The sinew would be dried, then split into fine strands, and these strands would be rolled together to create thread of varying thicknesses. The finest thread, used for seams that needed to be watertight, was barely thicker than modern dental floss. Thicker threads were used for structural seams or for attaching pieces together. The stitching technique for waterproof seams was particularly sophisticated. A double or triple stitch would be used, with each pass of the needle overlapping the previous one, creating a seal that water could not penetrate. The tension had to be perfect. Too loose, and gaps would remain. Too tight, and the sinew might cut through the skin, weakening it. Women learned this tension through years of practice, developing a feel for exactly how much pressure to apply. Repairs were constant and necessary. A seam might split after weeks of use. The sinew thread, exposed to moisture and friction, would weaken and break. A patch of sealskin on a boot might wear through from walking on rough ice. These repairs had to be done promptly, often by lamplight in the evening, the woman sitting with the garment in her lap, the needle and sinew ready, making small, careful stitches to restore the integrity of the clothing. Mittens were worn rather than gloves. Keeping the fingers together generated more warmth than separating them. The mittens were also double-layered. Inner mittens of soft caribou fur, outer mittens of tougher sealskin. The palms of the outer mittens were often reinforced, as the hands were used constantly for gripping tools, handling ice, and other tasks that would wear through softer material. The entire clothing system was designed not just to keep the body warm but to prevent sweat. This might seem counterintuitive. Why worry about sweat in a freezing environment? But sweat was the enemy. If a person overheated and began to perspire heavily, the moisture would soak into the inner layers of clothing. This moisture would then freeze when the person stopped moving or when they entered the cold igloo environment. Frozen moisture in clothing destroyed its insulating properties and created a direct path for heat loss from the body. To prevent this, the Inuit managed their clothing actively. If a person felt themselves getting too warm, they would adjust. They might pull their hood back, allowing heat to escape from the head. They might pull their arms out of the sleeves of the parka, leaving the sleeves empty while the arms remained inside the garment, against the body. They might open vents at the neck or waist, allowing cold air to circulate and cool the body. This active management required attention and experience. A person had to monitor their own body constantly, feeling for the first signs of warmth or perspiration, and adjusting before sweat could accumulate. It was a skill learned from childhood, taught through observation and practice. The clothing also required maintenance. After use, wet or damp items had to be dried, either above the qulliq or outside in the cold, dry air. The fur had to be kept clean, brushed free of ice and snow. Seams had to be checked and repaired. The garments were not disposable. They represented significant labour. The hunting of the caribou, the preparation of the hides, the sewing, and they had to be cared for to last through the winter. Children's clothing followed the same principles as adult clothing, but was adapted for their needs and size. Infants and very young children, as mentioned, were often carried naked in the mother's amount, but once they were old enough to walk and play outside, they needed their own clothing. These garments were miniature versions of adult clothing, small parkas with hoods, small trousers, tiny mittens and boots. But children's clothing was often looser and more forgiving than adult clothing. Children grew quickly, and garments had to last through a season or more. The loose fit allowed for growth and also gave children more freedom of movement for play. The decoration on children's clothing was sometimes more elaborate than on adult clothing, with extra fur trim or beadwork, perhaps because parents took particular pride in dressing their children well, or perhaps to make the children easier to spot against the snow. As children grew older and became more active, their clothing needs changed. A young hunter learning his craft might wear garments that were more durable, with reinforced knees and elbows. A girl learning to sew might wear clothing that her mother made specifically for teaching. Garments that demonstrated different techniques, with visible examples of various stitches and seam types. The seasonal transition of clothing was also carefully managed. As winter turned to spring and temperatures began to rise, the double-layer system might be modified. The inner layer might be removed during active work, leaving only the outer layer. Or lighter-weight caribou fur from summer hides that had shorter hair might be substituted for the heavy winter fur. Storage of off-season clothing required care. Garments needed to be cleaned, dried thoroughly, and protected from moisture and insects during storage. They would be packed carefully in bags made from sealskin or caribou hide, sometimes with dried plants that repelled insects. These storage bags would be kept in the coolest, driest part of whatever dwelling was being used, ensuring that when winter returned, the clothing would be ready and in good condition. The caribou fur parkas and trousers were not just functional. They were also beautiful. The women who sewed them took pride in their work, creating garments that were well-fitted, durable, and often decorated. Strips of different coloured fur might be inlaid to create patterns. Beads, when available through trade, might be sewn onto the edges. The clothing was art as well as technology, a reflection of skill and cultural identity. But beauty was secondary to function. The clothing had to work. It had to keep the body warm, manage moisture, resist wind, and allow freedom of movement. A well-made set of caribou clothing could mean the difference between life and death in the Arctic winter, and the Inuit, through generations of experience, had perfected the design. The result was a clothing system that allowed humans to survive in temperatures that should have been impossible. With proper clothing, properly maintained, a person could spend hours outside in 40 below zero temperatures without suffering frostbite or hypothermia. They could walk, hunt, travel, and work. The clothing was their portable shelter, their second skin, the technology that extended the human body's ability to function far beyond its natural limits. Survival in the polar night was not a solitary endeavour. The image of a single igloo, isolated on the ice, is misleading. The Inuit lived in groups, in small interconnected communities that provided not just physical support but psychological and social stability. During the winter months, families would often build their igloos in clusters, close enough to provide mutual support but with enough space to avoid crowding. The igloos might be arranged in a loose circle or line, depending on the terrain and the number of families. In some cases, the igloos were actually connected by low, tunnel-like passages, creating a network of spaces that could be moved through without going outside. These connected villages were practical. They allowed people to visit neighbours without exposing themselves to the cold and wind. Children could move between households. Elders could be checked on. Conversations could be held without standing in the bitter cold. The passages were low and narrow, requiring crawling or stooping, but they served their purpose. But even when igloos were not physically connected, they were socially connected. The Inuit lived in what might be called an intensely communal culture. Privacy in the modern sense was not a value or even a concept. People lived in close quarters, in constant view and earshot of others. Actions, words, and behaviours were observed, discussed, and evaluated by the group. This closeness created a need for strong social norms and conflict resolution mechanisms. In a small, enclosed space, where retreat was not possible, the ability to manage disagreements, to maintain harmony, and to cooperate was essential. The Inuit social structure was built around these needs. One of the most fundamental norms was sharing. The principle, called qulliq, governed the distribution of resources. A successful hunt did not belong to the hunter who made the kill, it belonged to the community. The meat, blubber, and skin would be divided according to specific rules, often complex and based on kinship, need, and social obligation. Elders and children were prioritized. A family with many young children would receive a larger share of meat. An elder who could no longer hunt would still be fed. The hunter who made the kill might actually receive a smaller portion than others, with the understanding that when others were successful, he would be provided for in turn. This system was not altruism in the modern sense, it was practical. In an environment where hunting success was unpredictable, where a hunter might go days or weeks without a kill, sharing ensured that no one starved. It spread the risk across the entire group. A family that was fed today, even though their own hunter was unsuccessful, would share their resources tomorrow when their hunter succeeded. But the system also created social bonds. It reinforced the idea that the group, not the individual, was the basic unit of survival. It created obligations, debts, and expectations that tied people together. To refuse to share was not just selfish, it was a violation of the fundamental law that made survival possible. Decision-making in these small communities was typically done by consensus. There were leaders, often elders or particularly skilled hunters, but their authority was based on respect and competence, not on formal power. When decisions needed to be made, where to hunt, when to move camp, how to respond to a crisis, the group would discuss. People would express opinions, offer suggestions, and debate. The goal was to reach an agreement that everyone could accept, not to impose the will of a majority or a leader. This consensus-based approach had advantages and disadvantages. It created buy-in and cooperation, as everyone had a voice and felt heard. But it could also be slow, and it required patience and a willingness to compromise. In a culture where survival depended on cooperation, however, these were skills that were highly valued and carefully taught. Conflict, when it occurred, was handled carefully. Direct confrontation, shouting, or aggressive behavior was discouraged. It created tension, disrupted harmony, and made the small, enclosed spaces of winter life uncomfortable for everyone. Instead, conflicts were often addressed indirectly, through humour, through subtle social pressure, or through the intervention of respected elders. Humour in particular was a powerful tool. Teasing, jokes, and satire could be used to criticise someone's behaviour without direct confrontation. A hunter who was lazy might be the subject of a humorous song or story. A person who hoarded food might be mocked gently. The message was clear, but it was delivered in a way that allowed the person to save face and change their behaviour without a direct challenge. Storytelling also played a role in social cohesion. The long hours inside the igloo during the dark months were filled with stories. Elders would recite the myths, legends, and histories of the people. These stories were not just entertainment. They were the repository of cultural knowledge, the teaching tool for children, the reinforcement of social norms and values. The stories explained the origins of the world, the relationships between humans, animals, and spirits. They taught moral lessons, the importance of generosity, the dangers of arrogance, the value of patience and respect. They passed on practical knowledge, how to read the weather, how to interpret animal behaviour, how to navigate by stars, and they created a shared identity. By hearing and retelling the same stories, the community affirmed its connection to the past, to the ancestors, to the land. The stories were a thread that tied individuals to the group and the group to its history. The physical closeness of winter life also meant that personal relationships were intense. Friendships, rivalries, romances, and tensions all played out in a very small space. People knew each other deeply, their habits, their moods, their strengths and weaknesses. This could be comforting, but it could also be suffocating. For children, the winter community was both a playground and a classroom. They played together in the snow, building small snow structures, sledding, playing games. Inside, they watched the adults, learning by observation. A girl would sit near her mother, watching the qulliq being tended, learning the subtle skills required. A boy would sit near his father, watching tools being made or repaired, learning the techniques. The community also provided psychological support. The polar night, for all its stillness and beauty, was also a time of darkness and cold that lasted for months. The sun's absence affected mood. The isolation, the limited movement, the repetitive nature of daily tasks. All of these could weigh on people, but the presence of others, the ability to talk, to share stories, to laugh together, to work together, provided a buffer against the psychological challenges. Visiting between households was common and important. Even a short visit, crawling through a connecting passage or walking a few yards across the snow to a neighbouring igloo, broke the routine and provided new conversation, new faces, new energy. These visits were not formal. They were casual, frequent, and woven into the daily rhythm. Visiting protocols, while informal, did follow certain patterns. A person approaching another family's igloo would typically announce their presence before entering, calling out or making a sound at the entrance. Simply crawling through the tunnel without announcement would be considered rude, a violation of the small amount of privacy that existed. Once inside, the visitor would be offered a place on the sleeping platform, usually near the lamp where it was warmest. If food was being prepared or eaten, the visitor would be offered some, regardless of how much the family had. This was not optional hospitality. It was obligation. To refuse to share food with a visitor would be a serious breach of social norms. The visit itself might have no specific purpose. The visitor might simply sit, warm themselves, engage in casual conversation. Or there might be a reason. To borrow a tool, to share news, to ask for help with a task, to check on someone who had been ill. The length of the visit varied. It might be a brief stop, just long enough to exchange a few words and warm up, or it might extend for hours, with the visitor eventually joining in whatever work or activity was happening in the household. These frequent visits served multiple functions beyond simple socialization. They were a way of monitoring the well-being of the entire community. If someone was sick, injured, or struggling, it would be known quickly through the network of visits. If a family was running low on food or fuel, others would know and could offer assistance. The visiting pattern created an informal but effective system of mutual aid and support. Elders held a particular position in the winter community. They were no longer able to hunt or perform the most physically demanding tasks, but their value lay in their knowledge and experience. An elder had lived through many winters, had seen many hunts, had faced many crises. They knew the stories, the techniques, the solutions to problems that younger people might not have encountered yet. Elders were consulted on important decisions. When the community needed to decide whether to move camp, where to hunt, how to respond to unusual weather or ice conditions, the elders' opinions carried weight. They would not command or dictate, but their advice would be carefully considered. In daily life, elders spent much of their time on the sleeping platform, staying warm, conserving energy. But they were not idle. They might work on small tasks, repairing tools, preparing sinew thread, teaching young children. And they were the primary storytellers, the keepers of the oral tradition, spending hours reciting the narratives that preserved the culture. The community's treatment of elders reflected the value placed on knowledge and continuity. An elder, who could no longer contribute physically, was still fed, still cared for, still given a warm place by the lamp. This was not charity or sentiment. It was recognition that the elders' knowledge and experience were valuable resources, as important in their way as the seal meat or caribou fur. Decision-making in practice often happened gradually and organically, rather than in formal meetings. An issue would arise. Perhaps the seal hunting at the current location had become poor, suggesting it might be time to move. One person would mention this, perhaps during a visit or while working on a task with others. Others would agree or disagree, offering their own observations. The discussion would spread through the network of visits over days. Eventually a consensus would emerge. Not everyone might agree completely, but enough people would be aligned that action could be taken. The decision would be implemented without any formal announcement or vote. Families would simply begin packing, and others would follow. Those who were more reluctant would see the momentum and would join in rather than being left behind. This process was slow, but it created buy-in. Because everyone had been part of the discussion, because everyone had been heard, there was less resistance and more cooperation in implementing decisions. It was a system adapted to a small-scale society where maintaining harmony was essential for survival. The connected village, whether physically linked by passages or socially linked by kinship and shared obligation, was the social infrastructure that made survival possible. No individual or family could survive alone. The skills, the resources, the labour, the knowledge, all were distributed across the group, and all were necessary. The polar night was not just a physical challenge, it was a social one, and the Inuit response was to turn inward, to gather close, to create a community that was tight-knit, interdependent and resilient. The darkness outside made the light inside, both literal and metaphorical, all the more important. Without the sun, time changed. The familiar rhythm of day and night, which structures life in most of the world, disappeared in the polar night. The sun did not rise, it did not set. There was no dawn, no dusk, no clear division between periods of light and dark. Instead, there was a continuum. The faint twilight glow at midday faded into the deeper darkness of late evening, which faded into the near-complete darkness of midnight, which gradually lightened again as the next midday approached. The moon's phases added variation. Bright periods when the full moon was up, darker periods when the moon was new or below the horizon. But these were cycles measured in weeks, not hours. The 24-hour clock, which is so fundamental to modern life, became meaningless. There was no reason to divide the day into hours, no external marker to distinguish morning from afternoon from evening. The Inuit did not use clocks. They did not track time in the way that a clock-based society does. Instead, time became fluid, organic, and event-based. People slept when they were tired. They woke when they were rested. They ate when they were hungry. They worked when work needed to be done. The external environment, the brightness or darkness of the sky, the phase of the moon, the state of the tide, provided cues, but these were not rigid schedules. The tides were one of the few reliable temporal markers. The ocean, even when covered by ice, still experienced tidal movements driven by the moon's gravitational pull. These tides affected the behaviour of seals, which were more likely to use certain breathing holes at certain times in the tidal cycle. Hunters learned to time their efforts to the tides, going out to hunt when conditions were favourable. The moon cycle also provided structure. The full moon period, when travel and hunting were easier, was a time of increased activity. The new moon period, when the darkness was deeper, was a time of rest and indoor work. The cycle repeated roughly every 29 days, and this gave a longer-term rhythm to the winter. But day-to-day time was flexible. A person might wake after 8 hours of sleep, or 12, or 6, depending on their needs and the circumstances. A family might eat 2 meals in what would be called a day, or 4, or just 1 large meal, depending on the availability of food and the rhythm of work. This flexibility was possible because the work itself was not clock-driven. There were no appointments to keep, no schedules to follow, no external demands that required being somewhere at a specific time. The tasks of daily life, tending the lamp, sewing, preparing food, hunting, were ongoing, but they did not have fixed time slots. This created a different relationship with time. Time was not a scarce resource to be managed and optimized. It was simply there, a background presence flowing at its own pace. There was no rushing, no sense of being late, no anxiety about wasting time. Things happened when they happened. This does not mean the Inuit were lazy or passive. They worked constantly. The tasks of survival filled their days, but the work was paced differently. It was steady, continuous, but not frantic. There was time to sit and talk, to tell stories, to play games, to rest when tired. The polar night, in this sense, was a season of slow time. The world itself was still, frozen, dark, quiet. And the human experience of time mirrored this stillness. Time did not rush forward. It moved like the lamp's flame, steady and unhurried. For children, this flexibility meant that there were no rigid bedtimes or wake times. A child might sleep when adults were awake and wake when others were sleeping. Parents would adjust, caring for the child as needed, without the stress of enforcing a schedule. For adults, the flexibility meant that work could be done when it felt right. If a woman felt rested and alert in what would be called the middle of the night, she might sew or prepare hides. If a hunter felt tired in the middle of the day, he might sleep. The lamp burned continuously, providing light whenever it was needed, so there was no particular reason to align activities with the external light or dark. This way of living required a different mindset. It required trusting the body's natural rhythms, trusting that sleep would come when it was needed, that wakefulness would provide energy for work. It required letting go of the need to impose structure externally, and instead allowing structure to emerge organically from the flow of needs and activities. It is difficult for people living in a clock-based society to fully grasp this. The modern world is governed by schedules, deadlines, appointments. Time is segmented into units, hours, minutes, seconds, and these units are treated as measurable, fungible, and scarce. Being on time is a virtue. Being late is a failing. But in the polar night, none of this applied. There was no on time or late. There was simply now, and the tasks that needed to be done now, and the rest that would come when the body needed it. The winter season itself was not seen as a time of waiting for the sun's return. It was a distinct season, with its own character, its own activities, its own value. The darkness was not something to be endured. It was simply the condition of the winter, no more negative than snow or cold. This acceptance was psychological as well as practical. The Inuit did not see the polar night as a problem to be solved, or a hardship to be escaped. They saw it as a part of the year, a season that had been part of their world for as long as their people had existed. In the soft, flickering glow of the qulliq, with the family gathered on the sleeping platform and the cold held at bay by snow walls and caribou fur, the long hours of darkness were filled with voices. This was the time for qulliq, storytelling, and it was as essential to survival as the lamp's flame or the hunter's patience. The stories were told by elders, primarily, though anyone might contribute. The elders were the living libraries of the people. They carried in their memories the accumulated knowledge of generations, the myths, the histories, the practical wisdom, the moral teachings. Without writing, without external records, all of this knowledge had to be stored in human memory and transmitted through speech. The telling usually began naturally. The work of the day would wind down. People would settle onto the platform wrapped in furs. The lamp would burn steadily, and someone, often a grandparent, would begin to speak. The voice of a storyteller in the igloo was quiet, steady, rhythmic. The stories were not performed with dramatic gestures or loud voices. They were recited in a measured, almost meditative tone, the words falling into patterns that had been repeated countless times before. The rhythm helped with memorization, both for the teller and the listener. The repetition was not boring. It was comforting, familiar, a connection to all the times the story had been told before. The stories fell into several categories. There were creation myths, explaining how the world came to be, how humans and animals originated, how the sun and moon and stars took their places in the sky. These stories established the cosmology of the Inuit worldview, a worldview in which everything, animals, plants, rocks, weather, celestial bodies, had spirit and agency. There were stories about the relationships between humans and animals. These were particularly important because they established the rules and ethics of hunting. In the Inuit worldview, animals were not simply resources to be exploited. They were beings with awareness, with choice. An animal chose to give itself to a hunter, and this choice had to be earned through respect, proper behavior, and correct ritual. The stories taught how to treat animals after they were killed, how to speak to them, how to butcher them, how to use every part, how to ensure that their spirits would return and allow themselves to be hunted again. These were not abstract philosophical teachings. They were practical survival knowledge. If the animals stopped giving themselves, the people would starve. One category of story that was particularly important was the tale of Sedna, or Nuliajuk, the sea woman. The details varied by region, but the core narrative remained consistent. Sedna was a woman who, through various circumstances, sometimes betrayal, sometimes her own actions, ended up in the ocean, where she transformed into the mother of all sea creatures. She lived at the bottom of the sea, and from her fingers, which had been cut off or transformed, came the seals, whales, walruses, and fish that the Inuit hunted. When hunters were unsuccessful, when the animals refused to come, it was believed that Sedna was angry. Perhaps humans had violated taboos, had been disrespectful to the animals, had failed to follow proper rituals. Her anger manifested as a tangling of her long hair and when her hair was tangled, she would not release the animals. The solution required a shaman to journey to the bottom of the sea in a trance state, to find Sedna, and to comb her hair, soothing her and convincing her to release the animals once more. This story was not just mythology. It was a practical explanation for the unpredictability of hunting, and it reinforced the importance of respecting taboos and maintaining proper relationships with the spirit world. Telling this story during the polar night, when the family's survival depended entirely on successful seal hunts, was a way of acknowledging the uncertainty of life, of explaining why some hunts succeeded and others failed, and of reinforcing the behaviours that the community believed would maintain good relations with the animals and spirits. There were stories about shamans, individuals who could travel between the physical world and the spirit world, who could speak with animal spirits, who could influence the weather, who could heal illness or curse enemies. These stories were often dramatic, filled with transformation, danger, and the crossing of boundaries that ordinary people could not cross. There were cautionary tales, stories about people who broke the rules and suffered consequences. A person who was greedy, who hoarded food instead of sharing, might be abandoned by the group or cursed by spirits. A hunter who was disrespectful to an animal might find that the animals refused to come to him. A person who violated a taboo, and there were many taboos governing behaviour, might bring disaster on themselves or their family. These stories were moral instruction, but they were also social control. In a culture without formal laws or police, where survival depended on cooperation and adherence to norms, stories were the mechanism for teaching and reinforcing proper behaviour. There were stories about ancestors, about specific people who had lived in the past and done notable things. These stories preserved history, the memory of migrations, of conflicts, of alliances, of great hunts or great storms. They kept the past alive, maintaining a sense of continuity and identity. And there were stories that were simply entertaining, trickster tales, humorous accounts of foolish behaviour, stories about strange encounters or unlikely events. These stories provided relief, laughter, a break from the seriousness of survival. The children listened. They absorbed the stories through repetition, hearing the same tales told again and again, each telling reinforcing the memory. By the time they were adults, they would know many of the stories by heart, and they would be able to tell them to their own children, continuing the chain of transmission. But storytelling was not just for children. Adults listened too, and they learned. Even hearing a familiar story again could reveal new details, new layers of meaning. The stories were complex, often containing multiple levels of interpretation, a surface narrative that was straightforward, and deeper meanings that required thought and experience to understand. The voice of the storyteller filled the small space of the igloo. The sound was absorbed by the snow walls, creating an intimate acoustic environment. The words seemed to come from close by, from within the circle of warmth and light. Outside, the wind might blow, the ice might crack, but inside there was only the voice and the listening. The telling of a story could take minutes or hours, depending on the story's length and the teller's style. Some stories were long, elaborate narratives with multiple episodes and characters. Others were short, focused on a single event or teaching. The teller would pace the story, pausing at dramatic moments, allowing time for the words to settle, giving the listeners space to absorb and imagine. Sometimes, after a story was told, there would be discussion. Someone might ask a question, seeking clarification or deeper understanding. Someone might offer a variant version of the story, noting that they had heard it told differently. Someone might comment on the story's meaning or its relevance to current circumstances. This discussion was part of the process, a way of engaging with the stories actively rather than passively receiving them. The stories were also flexible to a degree. While the core elements remained constant, the characters, the main events, the moral teachings, the details could vary. A storyteller might emphasize certain aspects depending on the audience or the situation. A story told to children might be simplified, while the same story told to adults might include more complex details or interpretations. This flexibility allowed the stories to remain alive and relevant. They were not fixed texts, frozen in time, but living narratives that could adapt while still maintaining their essential form and function. Children's role in storytelling evolved as they grew. Very young children were simply listeners, absorbing the stories without necessarily understanding all the details. They would sit in their parents' laps or nestle under the caribou furs, their eyes heavy, the sound of the storyteller's voice lulling them towards sleep. As children grew older, they would begin to participate more actively. They might ask questions during or after a story. They might be called upon to repeat parts of a story they had heard before, testing their memory and comprehension. This repetition was part of the learning process, ensuring that the stories were being passed on accurately. By adolescence, young people were expected to know many stories well enough to tell them, at least in simplified form. A young man or woman might be asked to tell a story to younger children, practicing the role of storyteller. The elders would listen, offering gentle corrections or suggestions, helping the young person refine their telling. The stories also served as a form of conflict resolution and social commentary. If someone in the community was behaving in a way that was problematic, being lazy, hoarding resources, showing disrespect, a story might be told that evening that contained a character who behaved similarly and have faced negative consequences. The message was indirect, allowing the person to hear the criticism without being directly confronted, preserving harmony while still addressing the issue. This indirect communication was particularly valuable in the close quarters of winter life. Direct confrontation could create lasting tensions that were difficult to resolve when people could not physically separate. Stories allowed for correction and guidance while maintaining the social fabric of the group. Music was also part of the winter nights, though it was different from storytelling. The Inuit had songs, many songs for different purposes. There were work songs, sung while sewing or preparing hides. There were hunting songs, sung to honour animals or to call them. There were drum songs accompanied by the large flat-frame drum. Drum dancing was a powerful practice. The drum was made from a wooden or bone frame, roughly circular, with a diameter of 1 to 2 feet or more. The surface was covered with animal skin, usually caribou or seal skin, stretched tight and allowed to dry. A wooden handle extended from one edge. The drum was held in one hand and struck with a stick held in the other. The sound was deep, resonant, a thud that seemed to come from the earth itself. The rhythm was steady, hypnotic, a pulse that filled the igloo and seemed to resonate in the chest and bones of the listeners. Drum dancing was often accompanied by singing or chanting, rhythmic vocalizations that might be words or might be sounds without specific meaning. The singer would stand or sometimes sit holding the drum, striking it rhythmically, moving their body slightly with the beat. The sound and movement created a trance-like state, a feeling of connection to something beyond the immediate physical world. Drum dancing was used in spiritual practices as a way of communicating with spirits or entering altered states of consciousness. Shamans would use drums in their work, the rhythm helping them to journey into the spirit world. But drum dancing was also social, communal, a way for people to come together, to share energy, to create something collectively. The sound of the drum in the igloo was powerful. The snow walls amplified and shaped the sound, creating a rich, enveloping acoustic experience. It was not loud in the sense of being painful or overwhelming, but it was present, filling the space completely, leaving no room for other thoughts or distractions. Games were another way of passing the long hours. String games, called a jarak, were particularly popular. These were similar to cat's cradle, a loop of string or sinew held between the hands manipulated to create various patterns and shapes. The Inuit had hundreds of string figures, each with a name and often a story associated with it. A person would create a figure, perhaps representing a caribou or a seal or a hunter, and then pass the string to another person, who would manipulate it into a different figure. The process required dexterity, memory, and practice. It was a skill that took years to master, and it was a form of both entertainment and teaching. Many of the string figures told stories as they were created, the shapes illustrating events or characters. The creation of string figures was often accompanied by recitation. As the figure was being made, the person manipulating the string would speak, narrating the story that the figure represented. The movements of the hands, the transitions from one configuration to another, illustrated the progression of the narrative. A figure representing a caribou hunt might begin with the string in a configuration representing the hunter, then transform through a series of steps to show the hunter setting out, finding the caribou, making the kill, and returning home. Learning these string games required patience and close observation. A child would sit beside an adult, watching the hand movements carefully, trying to memorize the sequence. The adult would perform the movements slowly, pausing to let the child observe, and then the child would attempt to replicate them. It might take dozens of attempts spread over many days or weeks before the child could successfully create a particular figure. The string games were portable, requiring only a loop of sinew or cord, and they could be performed anywhere, inside the igloo by lamplight, or outside during the brief twilight periods, or during travel. They were a constant presence in daily life, a form of entertainment and education that was always available. Wrestling was also practiced, especially by young men. The space inside an igloo was limited, but outside, when conditions allowed, wrestling matches would be held. These were tests of strength and skill, but also of endurance and pain tolerance. Wrestling in extreme cold required toughness, and it was a way for young men to prove themselves. Other games included various forms of contests, throwing competitions, accuracy challenges, tests of balance or agility. These games served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment, they built skills that were useful for hunting and survival, and they established social hierarchies and reputations. But through all of this, the stories, the songs, the games, the underlying current was connection. The long darkness, the small enclosed spaces, the constant proximity to others, all of this created an environment where human connection was not optional. It was constant, unavoidable, and essential. The stories told in Lamplight were more than just words. They were the threads that tied the community to its past, its values, and its identity. They were education, entertainment, and social glue. They made the long hours of darkness bearable, even meaningful. They transformed the igloo from a shelter into a space of culture, memory, and shared experience. After months, 2, 3, sometimes 4 depending on the latitude, the cycle began to turn. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. The faint twilight glow on the southern horizon, which had been lasting for a few hours each midday, began to last a little longer. The quality of the light changed, becoming less indigo, more amber. The Inuit noticed these changes. They were attuned to the sky, to the subtle shifts in light and colour. They knew the sun was returning, not because of any calendar or countdown, but because they could see the evidence in the growing brightness, in the longer periods of twilight, in the angle and intensity of the light on the horizon. The anticipation of the sun's return was real, but it was not dramatic. There was no collective anxiety, no counting down the days. The sun would come back when it came back. It always had. The certainty of this was absolute. But still, there was a sense of change in the air. The season was turning. The deepest part of winter was passing. The community, which had been turned inward for months, began to look outward again. The first true sunrise, the moment when the top edge of the sun's disk appeared above the horizon, was a significant event, though it was observed quietly. People might go outside to watch, standing on the ice or on a high point looking south. Children, who might have been born during the summer and had never seen the sun, or who were too young to remember its last appearance, experienced it for the first time. The first light was brief. The sun would touch the horizon, a brilliant, blinding arc of orange and gold, and then it would slip below again. It might be visible for only a few minutes, but it was there. The darkness, which had been complete, was now broken. Over the following days and weeks, the sun's appearance would lengthen. Each day it would rise a little higher, stay a little longer. The twilight periods would expand. The landscape, which had been silver and black under moonlight, now took on the warm colours of sunrise and sunset, reds, oranges, pinks, golds. The temperature did not change immediately. The sun's light in early spring was weak, and the Arctic remained bitterly cold. But the psychological impact of the sun's return was significant. Light, even weak light, affected mood. The long darkness, for all its stillness and peace, had been a season of containment. The light opened things up again. The return of the sun also signalled the beginning of a transition in activities. The winter pattern, hunting at seal breathing holes, living in igloos, relying on stored food and the lamp, would gradually shift to spring and summer patterns. Seals would begin to haul out onto the ice to bask in the weak sunlight, making them easier to hunt. Birds would begin to return, their migrations timed to the lengthening days. The ice would begin, eventually, to weaken and break up, opening leads of water. But this transition was slow. The sun's return was not the end of winter. It was the beginning of a long, gradual warming that would take months. The polar night's end was just the first step. For the Inuit, the sun's return was not a rescue or a relief from suffering. It was simply the turning of the wheel, the natural progression of the seasons. The winter had been a time of darkness, stillness, and inward focus. The spring would be a time of light, movement, and outward activity. Both were necessary. Both were part of the cycle. The stories told in Lamplight during the dark months had reinforced this understanding. The world moved in cycles, the suns rising and setting, the moons waxing and waning, the coming and going of animals, the birth and death of people. Nothing was permanent. Everything changed, and everything returned. The bonds forged during the winter, the sharing of food and fuel, the closeness of living in connected igloos, the stories and songs shared in the lamp's glow, did not disappear with the sun's return. They remained, carried forward into the next season, strengthened by the experience of survival together. The lamp, which had burned steadily through the long darkness, would continue to burn as the light returned. It was still needed for warmth, for drying clothing, for melting snow. But gradually, as the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher, the lamp's role would diminish. The sun itself would become the primary source of light and warmth once again. The igloo, which had been a refuge and a home, might be abandoned as families moved to summer camps, or it might continue to be used for a while longer, until the warming made it impractical. The snow would begin to soften, the ice glaze would melt. The structure that had been so solid and protective would eventually collapse back into the snow from which it came. But the knowledge of how to build it would remain. The skills, the understanding of snow and ice and insulation and heat, all of this was carried in the minds of the people. Next winter, when the sun departed again, new igloos would be built. The cycle would continue. The polar night was not an anomaly or a disaster. It was a season, as natural and expected as summer. The Inuit had learned, over thousands of years, how to live within it. They had developed technologies, the igloo, the qulliq, the caribou clothing, that turned the harsh environment into a survivable, even comfortable one. They had created social structures, sharing, consensus, storytelling, that maintained cohesion and morale through the long darkness. And they had cultivated a psychological approach, patience, acceptance, adaptability, that allowed them to inhabit the polar night without fighting against it. They did not see the cold and darkness as enemies to be conquered. They saw them as conditions, as the nature of their world, as something to be understood and worked with. This was the essence of their survival, not resistance, but adaptation, not conquest, but harmony, not fear of the darkness, but the creation of a light within it. The sun returned, as it always did. The first sliver of light appeared on the southern horizon, a brilliant spark against the ice. The world began to brighten. The long season of darkness ended, giving way to the season of light. But the memory of the winter remained, the warmth of the igloo, the glow of the qulliq, the voice of the storyteller, the taste of seal meat, the feel of caribou fur, the sound of the drum, the sight of the aurora, the patience of the hunter, the skill of the woman tending the lamp, all of this was carried forward. The polar night had been survived, not through struggle, but through knowledge, community, and the quiet, persistent creation of warmth in the coldest place on earth. The Inuit had taken snow and made shelter. They had taken seal oil and made light. They had taken the long darkness and made a season of stories, of closeness, of peace. And when the sun returned, they were there to greet it, their community intact, their knowledge preserved, their way of life continuing as it had for countless generations before. The polar night in the Arctic was a time when the sun disappeared for months, when temperatures dropped to extremes that should have been lethal, when the world became dark and frozen and still. To an outsider, it might have seemed an impossible environment for human life. But the Inuit did not just survive the polar night, They lived through it with dignity, comfort, and even a kind of peace. They did this not by fighting against the cold and darkness, but by understanding it, by working with the materials and conditions the Arctic provided, by creating technologies that were simple in form but profound in function. The igloo was built from snow, the very substance of the frozen world, transformed through knowledge and skill into a warm, safe shelter. The qulliq lamp burned seal oil, turning the product of the hunt into light, heat, and the ability to dry clothing. The caribou fur clothing used the hollow hairs of an animal to trap air and create insulation that could keep a human body warm in temperatures that would freeze flesh in minutes. But beyond the technologies, the Inuit survival depended on something less tangible: their social structure, their patience, their acceptance of the world as it was. They lived in close communities, sharing every resource, because survival alone was impossible. They told stories and sang songs in the lamplight, because culture and connection were as necessary as food and warmth. They waited motionless on the ice for hours in the profound cold, because patience was the price of success. The polar night was not a time of suffering or desperate endurance. It was a season with its own rhythm, its own activities, its own value. The darkness was not empty. It was filled with starlight, moonlight, the aurora's gentle curtains, and the warm glow of lamps in snow-domed homes. The stillness was not oppressive. It was profound, a silence that allowed for reflection, for story, for the quiet work of maintaining life. When the sun finally returned, rising above the horizon after months of absence, it was welcomed. But its return was not a rescue. It was simply the turning of the cycle, the movement from one season to the next. The Inuit had never been abandoned or lost. They had been there all along, living through the darkness with the same care and skill with which they lived through the light. Their survival is a testament to human adaptability, to the power of knowledge accumulated and passed down through generations, and to the possibility of creating warmth and community even in the coldest, darkest places. The polar night showed that humans could inhabit even the extremes of the earth, not by conquering them, but by finding a way to live within them, in harmony with the conditions that defined them. Rest now, and let the image of that lamplit igloo glowing softly in the vast Arctic darkness accompany you into sleep. Let the stillness of the polar night, the patience of the hunter, the warmth of the caribou fur, and the steady voice of the storyteller carry you forward. The darkness is not something to fear. It is simply another part of the world, and humans have found ways to make even the darkness a place of light, warmth, and home.